name is Michael Bryce. I'm the Director of Consumer and Public Affairs at the OUR. We will now have the official welcome to this conference by the Director General of the Office of Utilities Regulation. Mr. Mian has been the Director General of the OUR since February 2009. He's a trained economist and financial analyst with just under 50 years experience working with private, public, international, and multilateral organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, the Director General of the Office of Utilities Regulation, Mr. Ahmad Zia Mian, will now address you.
Good morning. Let me begin by extending a very special welcome to Honourable Minister Pickersgill, who is representing the Most Honourable Prime Minister Portia Simpson, who happens to be out of town because of emergency reasons, and he will be delivering his speech on her behalf. And I must, Honourable Minister, we are really deeply honored by your presence for a number of reasons. And one of them is that it is under your stewardship back in the early 90s when the OUR was established. You were the one who commissioned the study. I came here as a World Bank advisor and was working with Mr. Pickersgill, and that is the time we did all the necessary and background work and the OUR was established. And I'm very happy that it can on you to open this particular forum, and we have completed 15 years, and that is we are really appreciative of the work you have done and the contributions you have made. I also want to warmly welcome members of the Cabinet, Ministers of State, representatives of the opposition, members of the diplomatic corps, the participants in the forum, many of whom have come from overseas, members of the media, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and my colleagues from the OUR. This public forum, which will take place today and tomorrow, is the main event commemorating the OUR's 15th anniversary. The theme of the forum was carefully selected as we wanted the discussion to focus on an important but often not fully appreciated aspect of regulation, which is how regulation can be a catalyst for sustainable development. This is particularly relevant in the context of the challenging economic situation which our country at present faces. And very importantly, in the context of the rapidly changing technological environment, transforming the global economy and international relations. Sustainable economic growth and development, together with job creation and effective social programs, require large-scale investments, and investments of such magnitude will only take place in an environment in which investors are confident of long-term sustainability, predictability, and an enabling business environment, which is characterized by the rule of law, highly developed human resources and institutions, and competitive infrastructure. This is especially true of the utilities sector, where there is an urgent need to replace aging and inefficient infrastructure, and for expansion to meet present and expected future demand. This includes all the utility services, energy generation, transmission and distribution, water and fuel, which is Minister Pickersgill's responsibility and his portfolio, and telecommunication, in particular the deployment of broadband on an island-wide basis, universal access to all but through the broadband. The government's vision and strategy for growth and investment, as set out in Vision 2030, provides the policy backdrop for the regulator to create an environment conducive to investment in the utility sector. The essential constituents of such an enabling environment include a level playing field, to promote competition, impartial rules and regulations, transparency, and predictability. These inspire confidence, which is an essential prerequisite for investors. The recent completion of West Kingston's 65 megawatt generation plant at a cost of $112 billion, and the bid by the Jamaica Public Service Company to invest some $600 million in a new electricity generation facility is proof that we are on the right track. This forum is an opportunity for regulators, industry, policy, and decision makers, consumers, businesses, and other stakeholders to discuss and exchange experiences and ideas related to this important area of regulatory activity. I hope that it will be a mutually enriching and rewarding 2 days. It now gives me great pleasure to invite Honourable Robert Pickersgill to address us and declare the forum open. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, unlike Zia, I can't claim 50 years. Mr. Director General, members of the Diplomatic Corps, staff of the OUR, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, it is very obvious that I'm not the Prime Minister. I'm merely a substitute. And there was this guest speaker who was trying to explain what a substitute is. And he said it is if you have a pane of glass and it gets broken and you put an old rag to stop anything coming in. That's a substitute. Remember I said a pane of glass. When he was finished, an old lady came up to him and said, "Sir, you are not an old rag, you are a real pane." I hope that you'll not so conclude when I'm finished. I'm honored to share in your forum, albeit briefly, due to other calls on my time, particularly as they relate to the restoration of our infrastructure following the ravages of Sandy, and not least of all, the recovery of our economy as a whole to one of sustained economic growth and development. Although this is what the Prime Minister said, it is appropriate for me this morning as well. In browsing through the program, I see that the participants in this forum will be engaged in 2 busy days, discussing and no doubt arguing about a number of important issues surrounding utilities, monopolies, markets and competition, investing in utilities, infrastructure, alternative energy, and regulation in its various forms. I trust that the discussions will go well and the outcomes will make a positive contribution to our national development in this important era of governance. The backdrop to this forum, as most of you are aware, is that it marks the 15th anniversary of the existence of the OUR. This institution was established during the watch of my distinguished predecessor, Mark, that's it's the Prime Minister's predecessor, the most honorable P.J. Patterson. It had the good fortune as having as its first Director General, Mr. Winston Hay, who had previously served, among other places, at the alumina refinery, Alpart, as the CEO of the Jamaica Public Service Company and a consultant for the World Bank on energy projects. The creation of the OUR was influenced by a confluence of circumstances in the domestic and international environments. particularly as they related to the telecommunications and electricity sectors. One of these circumstances was the acceptance here in Jamaica and indeed elsewhere that the state should not, under normal circumstances, involve itself in activities that could be more efficiently and effectively carried out by the private sector or the community, or, importantly, where there was no substantial public interest to take into account. In light of this consideration, significant or whole ownership of the electricity generation, transmission, and distribution, as well as the telecommunication sector, was in the process of being transferred from the state to the private sector. As a consequence, it became even more important for the successor private owners to be more properly regulated. Secondly, was the fuller recognition of the importance of efficiently run utilities in national development. I need not emphasize how much bearing efficient and fair price utilities have on the cost of doing business in Jamaica or any country for that matter. In the energy sector, for example, there are significant impacts on the competitiveness of our goods and services, the disposable incomes of persons and businesses, and the country's foreign exchange budget. In regard to the telecommunications, a state-of-the-art sector with competitive prices for the various services is an absolute necessity for economic development. Third, the recognition of the need for a competent, visible hand as regulator to balance the needs, on the one hand, of capital to operate in a reasonably predictable rather than unpredictable environment, and to be able to secure fair and competitive returns on investments, and on the other, of consumers who expect reliable, fair-priced, and quality services. The recognition for a new type of regulatory infrastructure evolved from the experience of regulation by licenses going back to the late 19th century, by what were rate boards between 1945 and 1966, and then by a Public Utilities Commission between 1966 and 1976, and thereafter by the minister responsible for utilities between 1976 and up to relatively shortly after the OUR was created. Time does not permit me going into issues which arose with each of these models of regulation, but I will cite just the last two listed above to illustrate the nature of the problem. In the case of the Public Utilities Commission, among the criticisms made of their mode of operation were difficulties in dealing with the accounting records of the companies, lack of well-trained staff to analyze data and provide sound technical advice, the quasi-judicial nature of hearings on rates, which took a considerable amount of time, followed by lengthy periods of deliberations before decisions were handed down, a tendency to be populist in regard to rate awards in the case of regulation by a minister. One of the main problems were the enormous pressures which were inevitably put on that person, being a political figure, to tilt the scales in a more politically popular direction. Of course, that was not our experience there. We were both very fair. The long and short of it all, Mr. Chairman, was that Jamaica was not being well served by these models, and that something had to be done about it. Some here present may recall when my predecessor, Mr. Pattison, in one of his budget speeches, dramatically contrasted the sizes of the telephone books in the earlier period, very small size, compared to the time, much larger size, when he was speaking to show the effect of a more modernist approach to securing investments in and the growth of a particular sector. Outside of these internal factors, the government at the time was also greatly influenced by the utilities regulatory practices of the United Kingdom, from which country we inherited or borrowed many of our governance principles. As practiced in the UK, there were separate regulatory bodies for different utilities. OFFER, offer, Ofgas, Ofwat, ORRR, Oftel, just to name some. But it has subsequently determined that mergers of some of these bodies were appropriate. So the Office of the Electricity Regulation, OFER, and the Office of the Gas Supply, Ofgas, were merged into form Ofgem in 1999. Last but not least, another factor which informed the setting up of the OER was the need for a focused institutional capacity and institutional memory to master and be in a position to make reasoned judgments on the issues surrounding utilities, not least of all in the rapidly evolving telecommunications sector. Here, the government was not only concerned with building institutional capacity and institutional memory, but also that the OER was enabled to operate as independently as possible. As such, it was established as one of so-called commissions of parliament. Further, for titular administrative purposes, it was located in the Cabinet Office. And we have here Cabinet Secretary on this. After a few years in the ministry responsible for utilities. The question may well be asked, how well has the office fared in these 15 years? First, there is little doubt that an institutional capacity has been built, which has made Jamaica far more knowledgeable and competent about matters in the major utilities of electricity and telecommunications than before. And in this regard, the OUR has been well served by some highly competent persons. I expect an applause. Yes. Second, whilst undoubtedly differences in perspectives and approaches have resulted in tensions from time to time between the OER on the one hand and the private utilities on the other, and indeed between the OER and the ministries responsible for utilities themselves, overall, it is my considered opinion that the experience has been a beneficial one. I should also say that personally, I do not necessarily see differences in regard to policies as bad things as such, for with open minds and the recognition that many issues are not verities, solutions can be found in the interest of all stakeholders, the government, the private operators, and the consumers. Whilst not by any means solely responsible for the developments in the utility sector, since the responsible ministries and their ministers, such as the current one, Mr. Paulwell, have played significant roles, the OUR can take some pride in respect of its part in the positive transformations which have taken place during these 15 years. To take the example of the telecommunications sector, since 1997, the year when the OER was established, some $2 billion has been invested in it. And among the outcomes is that whereas we had 439,000 fixed and cellular lines then, the comparable number in 2010 was approximately 3,445,000, an eightfold increase. Investments in the electricity sector, whilst less spectacular than the telecommunications sector, amounted to some $354 million between 2005 and 2010, with another $450 million or more to be shortly invested in the 360 megawatt capacity implementation, which is due to begin next year. This, as you know, is an important activity to help us to reduce the energy costs to the Jamaican public. In respect of the future, the OUR has its work cut out for it. In its 2010-2011 annual report, it cited the following objectives for the telecommunications and electricity sectors. First of all, conduct a broadband baseline data, using the findings of which will inform the development of a new universal service stroke access policy. Then, complete work on the proposed automated number administration system for managing and allocating toll-free numbers, which will allow for improved operational efficiencies in number management and administration. Next, recommendations of mobile references interconnection offers, referred to as RIOs, in order to develop a standard RIO. Followed by development of a long-run least cost LRSC model for mobile networks to ensure rates are developed on a cost basis using competitive indices. In the electricity sector, to lay the basis for breaking the cycle of crisis addition to generation capacity, with the procurement over the next years of some 480 megawatts of new generating capacity replacement and addition. Creation and maintenance of an investment environment that is a facilitation of competitive addition of least economic cost generation. Creating and enforcing a system of incentives designed to reduce electricity loss. Intensify monitoring and surveillance of all licenses within the electricity sectors. Building institutional capacity as a contingency for regulation of fuel procurement and of a natural gas sector in the event of its emergence. These objectives, as well as others not mentioned, will test the OUR's capacity to find innovative solutions in a flexible way to address the issues in the electricity and telecommunications sectors. Just in case the public views the OUR as confined to the regulation of the telecommunications and electricity sectors, it has set a number of objectives for the water and sewage, as well as the transportation sectors. These two, I need hardly say, are very, very important in achieving our national development goals. Ladies and gentlemen, let me end by once again congratulating the OUR on its anniversary and wish for it, as the saying goes, more strength to its arm in respect of the challenges ahead. Finally, I wish all the participants in this forum a productive 2 days. And let me now declare this forum open. But I will also report to the Prime Minister that when I was finished, you all got up and gave me a standing ovation.
There are issues with the market system from time to time, in that there are what we economists refer to as market failures. One of these is the existence of monopolies, or natural monopolies, and so there is the need for regulation. So regulation sometimes is required when the market system left to itself will not deliver what we would like it to deliver. A natural monopoly is defined as one where, given the technology, it's cheaper for one producer to produce than to have several producers. And in fact, the market will only support profitably one. Competition agencies help to make sure that practitioners behave well by the rules to keep competition going, but there is, as I said, there might be need for a regulatory agency when competition is not able to work. The government also affects competition through its policy, including its taxation policy. And part of the call for tax reform isn't just lower tax rates. That's just a convenient byproduct. The real benefit from a tax reform is leveling the tax field so that the competitive forces might truly determine where resources go, and we will get the highest possible standard of living. So the government can affect competition by giving license who to operate and who not. Monopoly. irrespective of the amount of license that the government may issue, that will not affect anything. But I'm not here this morning to make the presentation. We have three very capable persons who I'm sure will stimulate our discussion. And first I'm going to invite, well, I should introduce all three panelists on the platform. We have Dr. Mark Jamison, who is the Director of Public Utilities Research Center and Telecommunication Studies at the University of Florida, Gainesville, I think. And we also have from our sister island, the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Glenn Kahn, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Regulated Industries Commission. And we all know Mr. Garfield Sinclair, who is the Managing Director of our oldest telecommunication company in Jamaica. I'm going to first invite Dr. Jamison to make his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. I'd also like to thank the people who invited me to be able to speak with you today. Zia and his colleagues that put together this program. It's an honor to be able to be here, and that's for two reasons. One is that as I look out over the audience, and indeed here at the panel as well, I see a lot of my students. And I've learned a lot from you over the years. And it's great to be able to see you again, to learn more from the very good work that you're doing, and to be able to talk about the ideas that challenge us, because this work of utility regulation is actually some of the most complicated work that a government does. And it's always a pleasure to be able to talk with people about those issues. The other reason why it's an honor is because if you stop and think about it, it takes a lot of courage to put together a program and open a mic for people to talk about your work. And so I think that for the OUR and for Zia, this is something to be thought about and to be respected, because you don't know what somebody like me or anyone else is going to say. But to give them that opportunity to speak before not just Jamaica, but actually for the whole world, it takes something to do that. As I've thought about this issue of, is it inevitable that we have natural monopolies or have monopolies for a lot of services in small economies? I'm reminded of an episode in my life a few years ago. I was sitting at the dinner table with my son. He was in his third year of high school, and we were working on his homework. And he was studying economics, which I'm an economist, so this warmed my heart. He's since never studied economics again. That had nothing to do with my coaching on his homework, though. So he's studying his economics, and he looked at me and he said, "Dad, what's a natural monopoly?" Of course, I got very excited. I've spent a lot of my career studying that issue. How do we know if something's a natural monopoly? And I said, "Well, John, a natural monopoly is just what Dr. Gordon had said. It's when it is less costly for a single firm to supply what the customers are demanding than for any other way that you could break it up among two or more firms." He looked at me, he looked at his book, he looked at me again, he said, "That's not what the book says." So what's your book say? He says, "Well, it says here a natural monopoly is whatever the government says it is." So I took two lessons away from that. One is that our economics textbooks for high schools in Gainesville, Florida are not very good. But also I took away that there's an insight there, that what is a natural monopoly can be looked at from several different perspectives. One is to kind of what's economically natural to have as a monopoly, and then there's what is politically natural to have as a monopoly. And that's what I'd like to talk about for my presentation here. Let's think about what's economically natural, what's politically natural, and then what is the role of troublemakers in trying to make sure we get this right. Let me start with just this kind of economic aspect of this. And when we thought about that, the definition is exactly as we've said so far. And generally, the way we think about that is we have this notion called economies of scale, which means that as a firm gets larger, its average cost goes down. And that's how we've tended to think about natural monopoly. It turns out, though, that that notion isn't quite right. It's not quite sufficient. Sometimes it works for us, but not always. Back about 30, 40 years ago, some economists started scratching their heads on this when we were working on telecommunications competition. And they looked at it and said, you know, this doesn't address the issue that we're facing. We have to have a better concept. And they came up with a word that I'll try not to use because it's clearly economics jargon, but it's the issue of subadditivity. And it simply hits right on the head that idea that if I break up a firm into smaller pieces, what happens to its total costs? Do they go up or do they go down? And as they looked at that issue and they tried to figure out, okay, what really drives that? There are several different things that could, but the one that really tended to drive it as much as anything is this basic idea that sometimes there are essential facilities. There are things that you have to have in order to provide that business. And if you start having multiple companies in that business, that facility has to be duplicated, and it's costly to duplicate it. So there are pieces of a business that it really is cheaper to only have one of than to have multiple ones. And you can stop and think about what that really is. So there are lots of different things like that. There might be, for example, meters. There's only really a need for one node between the customer and the network that provides power. There really is only need for one set of lines that distributes the power to the customers. There really is only need for one conduit that we might run our fiber optics in. For example, there was a country in Africa about 4 years ago that what they did is the government took on the task of trenching along the roads and invited anyone who wanted to drop fiber optics into that trench, understanding that the natural monopoly wasn't the fiber optics, it was the trench. And so the government said, all right, we'll provide that. Anybody who wants to drop their fiber into that trench, that's fine with us. Pipes in the ground, another facility that is just uneconomical to duplicate. And so we have these types of facilities. And this tends to drive that notion of what is or is not a natural monopoly. Do we need more than one facility in order to be able to have competition? If we do, how costly is that? If it's too costly, then we're better off with a single firm than with multiple firms. And that this provision of this core facility is actually then kind of what we call quasi-governmental. You're providing a public service, sometimes best done by the government, in the case of this African country trenching, sometimes best done under concession with a private entity doing it. And that situation varies from place to place. So we think about it in those terms in economics. That's essentially what we're looking for. Again, there's lots of complications we could go through, but that's kind of the core idea. However, there's several problems with trying to apply that idea easily. And I can go through a whole long list of them, but let's keep it to ones that we tend to run into most often. One is that if we try to focus just on that piece and then have everything else competitive that might be related to it, we then have to create a market. Take, for example, in the United States, we've had electricity distribution is a monopoly. Electricity transmission is also basically a monopoly. Generation in many parts of the country has been opened up to competition. And that kind of made sense because generation can be competitive. But what happens when you take a part of the company away, and I'm going to create a market for that piece of the company, there are costs involved in that doing too. And so my colleague at PERC, Ted Curry, who many of you know, is just now completing a study looking at when we split generation off and said that will be competitive, in creating that market, did we make customers better off? And the surprising answer was no. Because the conventional wisdom, and if you look at the statements of the regulators in the United States, they all just presume that we made customers better off because now we have competition. But what Ted found was that when we created that market, we also created the costs for that market. And that didn't make prices go up, but prices didn't go down either. So we want to think very carefully, maybe we have something that's part of a natural monopoly, and there are things that are adjacent to it, and maybe we think we can split those off and have those become competitive, but not always. Sometimes the competition doesn't benefit the customers. Now, we also have a problem in thinking about natural monopoly is, yeah, the technology may be natural monopoly, but is this business a natural monopoly? Those are two separate things. The technology maybe something that we don't really want to duplicate, that's costly, but does that mean that this firm is the best provider of that technology? And you don't know without competition. So we have some ideas on how we think about that. One is we have competition across markets. So maybe the distribution and transmission in electricity, or in some cases, mobile cell towers, in some instances are also tend to be monopolistic, not generally, but sometimes that happens. What we can tend to have is benchmarking across utilities. And that serves as that competition, and the regulator can use that information for setting prices. We can also have competition for concessions. That gives us that competitive element, but recognizing that indeed the piece is indeed a natural monopoly. And then we always, though, have to be cautious. When we look at the technology a business is using and conclude that, yes, that looks like a monopoly, if the business already is a monopoly, chances are they designed their system to look like a monopoly. Not to try and deceive anyone, but if you're a single firm, you design your system for a single firm. And so one of the things we discovered in breaking up telecommunications in the United States is while when we looked at it, we thought, well, this looks like a natural monopoly. The antitrust authorities disagreed, so they broke the system up. We found that under competition, the system changed, and we didn't know how it was going to change. And so sometimes that competition reveals things that we didn't think were going to be true. And then one more caveat on how economists think about natural monopoly. It's something that Dr. Gordon said in his introduction, is that we're assuming a particular static technology. And in reality, the world is changing very fast. And so sometimes we will latch on to a technology and say, we're going to design markets around this, but markets actually would choose a different technology, or time will. So it's kind of a rule of thumb for economists anyway. In thinking about what is or is not a natural monopoly, if indeed we have some facility that is essential for providing the service, and it's costly to duplicate, and it's stable, then we probably have a natural monopoly. We may want to have regulation that benchmarks this company against others. We may want to do what we can to make sure the operator is efficient in what it's doing, but that does indeed look like a natural monopoly as long as those kinds of conditions are true. So that's how economists think about natural monopoly. But then, as I learned from my son, sometimes what's economically natural isn't always politically natural. In the world of politics, there are different perspectives, different conflicting perspectives that come to bear. And I think in this space of thinking about what is or is not a monopoly, we actually have quite a friction within the political system. On the one hand, it's very natural for some in politics, or some in the political arena, to think about, to find a lot of monopolies, or to try and have a lot of industries be monopolies. And it's for a very good reason. The most profitable business structure is monopoly. And if you can have a monopoly in the political arena, that gives you a lot of profits to work with, that you can use then to benefit constituents, to have to tax, to do other things with. And so there's a tendency to overstate what is and is not a monopoly in the political arena. But then you have this other conflict going on at the same time, this other tension that works the opposite direction. And that is this tension of, if we have a monopoly that's working reasonably well, then we should be able to use what it does to benefit our constituents in a different way. So we have this tendency to try and break up the monopoly, to try and improve things, to try and use what the resources are there to accomplish what we have, what we want for other issues in our political lives. And so that kind of tension keeps us moving back and forth in the political arena. What's politically natural for monopolies is very unstable. Sometimes it goes one way with too many monopolies. Sometimes it goes the other way with too few. And that takes us then to this step of, what is the role of a troublemaker? Now let's think about what we mean by a troublemaker. And I'm going to say that troublemakers are really, really important to us, because I've just described it in the economic arena. What we need is someone that pokes and perturbs the system, because whether or not something really is a natural monopoly, we don't know without testing it. without kind of pushing ideas and trying different things. And the people who do that, there are troublemakers. And we all know what we do with troublemakers, right? We try to silence them. We try to push them aside. We don't invite them to meetings where we're having important discussions. We know what troublemakers are like. Now, of course, we all understand in Jamaica there are no troublemakers, right? I mean, I'm always impressed when I come to Jamaica and I talk with people about Zia. They say, this Zia is such a swell guy. All the politicians love him. Think he always makes the decisions they want him to make. The media loves him. They never have a criticism of him. The utilities love him. Zia is one of these regulators that is sometimes a troublemaker. And that's important. It's important to have someone that kind of pokes at things and says, maybe this isn't right. Maybe we should think about things. Sometimes the role of the troublemaker is the politician, although that's hard. Sometimes it's a regulator, although that's dangerous. Sometimes it's an academician, and that's kind of actually our jobs, is to do that kind of a thing. The troublemaker can come from a lot of different directions, a lot of different places, and their job is to challenge how people think about things. And we actually need that in thinking about this issue of natural monopoly, because the world is always changing. And in the economic perspective of natural monopoly, we don't know what really is until we look at it carefully and look at alternatives. And the troublemaker creates those alternatives. In the political arena, we've got the tensions going back and forth. And the troublemaker has to challenge both of those conflicting notions and say, are you really thinking about this well? And so let me just conclude with some notions of what this is about from my perspective. So if I had to answer directly the question, is it inevitable in a small economy that we have natural monopolies? The answer is yes, but we don't really know unless we try some other things as well. And the question is, how do we try things without losing the good things that we have? And as I look at it from a political perspective, the answer is yes, but how do we know? How do we know what the political tension is that's giving us the answer we have right now? And this gets us then to that critical role of the troublemaker in helping us sort through these issues. And I'll close with kind of what I have as 3 rules for troublemakers. And we all need to be willing to play that role sometimes. That one rule for the troublemaker is to not look for best practice, but instead ask, what's my next practice? Because we're going down a road with our technology and economic changes that none of us have been down before. And since none of us have been down this road before, there are many things that are no longer best practice, and we need to know which ones are not. So we have to think about what kind of safe experiments can we have to kind of see where the natural monopoly really is and where it really is not. And that then takes us to our second role for the troublemaker. And the question isn't what will I do, but why will I do it? Because we don't have the answer. If we say, here's what I should do, we think we have the answer, and we really don't at this point. So the question is why? What did we learn from our previous experiences? What will we learn from our next experiences? And not just what really made things work well, but what caused failures. If we're not having failures, we're not trying hard enough. We want to know what we're learning from those failures. And then the third one is, rule for troublemaker, it's not about leading. The person who says I'm the leader is the person who says I have the answer. And I'm suspicious of people that say they have the answers these days. I think it's really about leadership. And that leadership is about how are we going to try different things? How are we going to perturb the system so we can see where the natural monopoly really is? But we don't want to give up what's taken us here as long as it's what also takes us into the future. So what do we really know for sure? And then what we don't know? And how do we test that and think about it? So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jemison. As I sat there listening, something crossed my mind, and the regulators might want to think about this. Imagine a light and power company. I think we can all safely agree that the distribution of electricity is a natural monopoly. We can't have several poles with several wires. And a company may require some legal protection for time X to be able to make that investment. But what happens if technology changes and we can transmit electricity in the same way that we transmit cell phone telecommunications? So it's the dilemma. If you don't give the protection, the investment might not be forthcoming. But if you do give too long a protection, you lock yourself in out of future technological advances. Interesting mind game. But now I'm going to invite Mr. Khan from the Regulated Industries Commission of Trinidad and Tobago to address us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by thanking Zia and the OUR for inviting me today to speak with you, and to also extend my congratulations on the celebration of the 50th anniversary of OUR. While I was listening to the earlier presentations, I just looked at something and I said, you know what? OUR and OCA, all you need is 2 C's in there. So perhaps when we were coming up with the name OCA, we really didn't think about it. It was strongly based on OUR, but just with a little injection of two letters, you know. I was here at the formation of OCA, so, and Winston Hay was the chairman of that meeting, so, you know, the name came easily. So I was just thinking about it and saying, you know, this is a very interesting thing. I couldn't answer the question that Dr. Gordon just posed. And also, I'd like to say that, you know, it's a pleasure again to be here with so many people I haven't seen for such a long time, and seeing them here today assembled, it makes me feel good to, you know, to welcome them and to at least give my views on something. Basically, most of what I will say you already know, and the little that I will say that you don't know is my own opinion. So I guess you'll be, you know, I could just give you my opinion and go and sit down, but I don't think that would work. Should I press going to the right? Is it like this? Okay, yeah. On Saturday mornings and Sunday mornings when I wake up, my wife is usually still asleep. I would go downstairs, I put on the television, and I look at Channel 11, which is the Parliament channel in Trinidad and Tobago. So there I would look at the debates, both from the Senate and the House of Representatives. So it wasn't unusual for me to go to the House of Lords and to read the debates there to see what they're talking about. So this is what Viscount Honourable said in relation to this topic. Capitalism and the marketplace are short-sighted and often have major defects. I don't know if you'll agree with that, but basically that is, you know, it's part of what I am saying in my discussion. There are basically 2 theories, regulatory policy: the normative theory and the positive theory. And the positive theory examines why regulation occurs, and the normative theories really seek to talk about what policies should do. On the positive side, the government is interested in overcoming asymmetries with the operator and aligning its interests with those of the operator. Customers desire protection from the market. The operator desires protection from rivals, and operators desire protection from the government opportunism. In respect of the normative theories, they seek to encourage competition, to minimize the cost of information, to provide price structures that improve efficiency, and to establish regulatory processes that provide for regulation under law, and so on. But there's also an alternative theory by a group known as the heterodox economists, those outside of the mainstream economics. And they stress that regulation is important for safeguarding against monopoly formation, the overall stability of markets, environmental harm, and to ensure a variety of social protections. So, how does regulation affect competition? Well, for me, regulation and competition seem like strange bedfellows. In fact, most people would suggest that the more competition that you have, you need less regulation. What is this competition we're talking about? Well, I think if you accept this, what I have here, competition is a mechanism by which consumers receive benefits through the provision of goods and services at price levels and quality suited to their needs. Mark was just saying that in the case of the competition he was talking about in generation, it really didn't provide any additional benefits for consumers. And if this is what competition is supposed to do, but we'll see if it's going to happen in the cases that I'm talking about. And I have two other points here about what competition is supposed to do. Provide the firms with the opportunity to produce new products and to give people a wider choice. But strictly speaking, when competition cannot be effective, regulation is generally a second best to a competitive market. What is competition? Well, we can think of it in a simple way as perfect competition, where you have your fresh produce market where there are many buyers and sellers. Or you can think about it as imperfect competition, where you have either monopoly or oligopoly. Well, Mark told you what monopoly is. Oligopoly is the competition of a few firms. Largely, neoclassical economists whose ideas have dominated most of the last 50 years of economic thought, they posit that markets are most efficient way to allocate resources, and when these fail, regulation is required. Some writers distinguish between output and input competition, and some competition for the market and competition in the market. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is competition for the market rather than competition in the market. Distinction really is important because the regulator acts as a facilitator in the case of competition in the market. I think we can all agree on the importance of competition. And the questions that generally come about when we're thinking about this is, how is competition to be introduced? And to what extent the competition should be introduced? In the case of electricity, we wonder, should it be limited to generation or to distribution activities? I think both Dr. Gordon and Mark said that in some cases, because of the structures, it's difficult to introduce it in other areas besides generation. Well, Britain started that with the dismantling of the generation from transmission and distribution, but they have now gone into something called retail competition, where people are able to have different providers providing them with the electricity. In Trinidad and Tobago, what happened is that in 1994, we unbundled transmission and distribution from generation. We had one vertically integrated company, but we sold off the generation assets and left the transmission and distribution provider as a monopoly. Now, what I'm saying here is in this case, it is where we had the competition for the market rather than in the market. What happened is that there was bidding for IPP to set up a 235 megawatts plant. And so one company won that bid, set up the plant. Probably about 15 years later, the government decided that it wanted to put up a aluminum smelter. And there was another situation again where there were other bidders to come into the market. And another company won this round of bid and set up another generation plant. So in our case, really the regulator had nothing to do with introducing competition in this market. So the topic that I'm speaking on, how can regulation assist? Regulation had nothing to do with it. In fact, it was the policymakers who decided what they wanted to do and how the process would take place. In our case, it put some pressure on the regulators because in our price setting activities, we have very little to do in terms of how the prices between the generators and the transmission and distribution company, how they are framed. So in a sense, the prices there are, for us, we have to take them as costs that are given, as opposed to costs that we can help to derive. And that's a situation that's not necessary to our liking. We, as regulators, would wish that we had something to do in respect of those things. But as it is, there's nothing that we can do. So, in the case of the last generator, when it was set up to be a 750 megawatt plant. But when the aluminum smelter was shelved by the new government coming in 2010, that would have taken up about 450 megawatts of the power. And now that it's no longer happening, the T&D company is forced to buy all of the power. And what it might end up doing is having to close down some of its aged plant to compensate for the new power that will be coming in through the new generator. So you might call that false competition, because it's not really competition. But I'm just explaining to you what has happened in relation to generation, which is the area we thought that there might have been competition in if you separate that from transmission and distribution. In respect of the water sector, here, again, another situation in which the regulator had basically nothing to do with. The on-the-ground situation is that we have about 50% leakage. And the government, in its wisdom, decided that what they were going to do is to bring about the establishment of a desalination plant. Well, currently the desalination plant only produces about 12% of the total water production in the country. Now this plant came about, again, by the same process of competitive bidding. So in the water sector, you might say the competition that was introduced in that sector was introduced in the form of competition for the market as opposed to competition in the market, right? But the problem with these things, just like in the case of the IPPs, is that in the case of the IPPs, you have to give them long power purchase agreements. One has 20 years, one has 10 years, one has 15 years. And in the case of the desalination plant, they have a 20-year water sale agreement. Now, as far as I know, over the 20-year life of this desalination plant, at the end of 20 years, when the government can purchase the plant is really useless, or perhaps I should say, has reached the end of its useful life. So if you acquire it, you're basically not getting an asset which has too much value. So, as I'm saying again, my view is that really what has happened is that when we talk about introducing competition in these sectors, water and electricity, it really is not the same kind of competition that you might speak about in telecommunications. In Trinidad and Tobago, again, what we had something called a management contract with Severn Trent from Britain. They came in the 90s, and they took over running of the water company. Now, to the average person on the outside, it would seem that by that activity, there was some improvement in the overall management of the organization, because they were efficient in collecting revenues, because they started to impose, cut off on people, so they would go and shut off your water if you didn't pay and so on, and therefore consumers would pay their bills. So the revenue collection under that entity seemed to have improved, and they were a little more efficient in attending the leaks and so on. But this experiment, let me call it that, also went by the wayside with the return to power of the People National Movement in 2001. You see? So basically, again, the regulators have not been the motive force pushing any area of competition. It has really been the policy makers or the politicians. Fair Trading Commission that was established some time ago, but I think they have moved away from that now. And I think you have one here. And this agency sort of guides and ensures that there's a sort of level playing field in the area of competition. So, in my view, there's really an inherent conflict in the production of public services between the commercial procedures used, maximizing profits, and the role of ensuring that all citizens have access to the services. And it is because of that conflict that the regulators come in. So the regulator, as far as I'm concerned, is not involved really in bringing about an environment for competition, but ensuring certain things that might be negative don't occur as a result of the lack of competition. And it's because of this that some of the activities that regulators might engage in, such as mentioned by Mark, benchmarking, those type of things, which sort of replicates competition if you want. So if the firms are going to, if the regulator is going to benchmark the provider against competitors, or sorry, similar type organizations and size in other countries, it might say to the regulated company, listen, you are producing this at this rate, this is your level of supply, these are the standards that you're meeting, and this is how you compare in relation to somebody. You need to improve. That's a way of introducing competition in a different sense through regulation. What the regulator is doing is try to force the utility to mimic competition by the activities it engages in. One of the things in respect of the competition by comparison, that's what I was just talking about, benchmarking and so on. Comparison with other utilities, or comparison in terms of the activities that you undertake. And the other thing that can be done is comparative sourcing, which is something that we are thinking about now. For instance, in Trinidad and Tobago now, we don't have meters as widespread as you have here in Jamaica for all consumers. Only a small proportion of the population, as the residential population, is metered. And it's something that the regulator is actively promoting now, that there should be meters for all people. One of the ways we think that this can be done is by comparative sourcing, so that people can again make bids to determine who is going to become the provider that's going to provide all of these meters and matters such as this. So those are the areas in which the regulator might have a role in doing something that will mimic competition within the regulated companies. Another way that the regulator might mimic competition is in terms of the shareholders and how the shareholders behave in relation to the companies. Well, it's not possible in terms of the state-owned enterprises because the shareholder is the government. And generally, the government doesn't apply any pressure on the public utilities to perform in a certain way. But if they were not government-owned, the shareholders might be able to apply some pressure to get them to mimic competition in terms of what they do. So basically, to make this story short, as I said, I'm not a believer that the regulator can do as much as is necessary to create competition, because the government's agenda is to create the environment, not the regulator. The regulator might facilitate it through the last things I've talked about, or by moral suasion. But really, the government in our case is the entity that really does all of the work, because it is the agency that decides whether there are going to be 3 IPPs, 4 IPPs, whether there's going to be a next desal plant. The regulator doesn't decide on that. You know? So we work within certain strictures, if you want to call it that. So my view is that in answering this question, can regulation support market forces? I don't think so. I think the policymakers are the ones which are going to do the things necessary to create that environment. Thank you very much.
We thank Mr. Khan very much for his presentation, and it's interesting that our next presenter Mr. Sinclair from Lime might have a slightly different view. Especially when you have networks, separate networks that have to interconnect, and so there is no real market force that determines that interconnection. That is clearly a regulated, a function for the regulator. And if the regulator doesn't get this right, clearly the dominant network has a strong incentive to use the dominance of his network to keep other players out. Well, I won't say who is the dominant and who is the lesser. This is purely theoretical. But we're going to hear now from Mr. Sinclair with his presentation. Mr. Sinclair.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. Good morning, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity that our regulator has given me this morning to address this distinguished forum. I'm rather used to regulators. I come from a banking background where we're regulated by the FSC and the Bank of Jamaica. So I'm quite comfortable actually in a regulated environment. And you're right, Dr. Gordon, we do have our first, I think, point of controversy this morning, because I couldn't disagree more about the role that a good regulator has to play in enhancing competition and indeed advancing the commercial interests of multiple players in a particular market. I especially want to acknowledge, before I go into my presentation, my Lime colleagues who are here as sort of my personal cheering group. And everywhere I go, I'm never far away from my Lime team who never leave me alone and are always supporting me. And I just want to thank them for that. We've really become a close-knit team over the last couple of years, and I think it has a lot to do with some of the good work we're doing in the marketplace. So the question I have to answer today is, does market liberalization always, not always, result in both lower prices and better service for consumers? First issue, obviously, is that in the commercial sphere, always is a loaded term. Nothing always happens. Some of us may wish that something would always be the case, that, for instance, we would always have been a sole provider. But, you know, so always is a bit of a challenge. And the other piece of that, obviously, is that it's going to have to result in both lower prices and better service. And both are not always possible to achieve. You probably note from my bio and the introduction that I'm neither a competition or a regulatory expert. However, what I'm going to hopefully share with you today, and why I think I was asked by the OUR to have this discussion, is that I'm going to try to give you a corporate and more commercial view of our regulator and regulation's position in advancing commercial interests. I want to state right off the bat, unequivocally, that the telecoms business is no simple business. Though every second person I run into on the street is telling me how to run mine. Everybody knows what we need to do. I do have had to unlearn a number of misperceptions about the market that I held from the outside looking in. And I've come to learn, among other things, that this business is not for the faint of heart. I mentioned that I come from a banking background where the competition was vigorous, but way more genteel. In the telecoms business, it's scorched earth. And big fun. Big fun. I'm actually, though, delighted to be part of the Lime family, which is the Caribbean's largest full-service telecoms company with a fairly proud history in the region. Essentially, we've always been working to improve the life of Caribbean people. And we believe we deliver the very best, and I have to preface stuff like that by saying we believe, because my competition's in the audience. So we believe we deliver the very best ICT services to governments, businesses, and families in 14 Caribbean countries with a single unifying purpose. That is building, connecting, and serving communities. We've also obviously continuously supported social development in many spheres, including sports, healthcare, education, and security. In other words, we've been excellent corporate citizens, and in Jamaica, we've been that way for 140 years. Having assumed responsibility for the lime business, however, in Jamaica, we recognized a couple of things right away. First was that despite liberalization, unfair competition was still, we believe, very pervasive and was still not being addressed by the existing legislation or regulations, though to be fair, wasn't for a lack of trying. In fact, mobile termination rates were extremely high and above cost. And though there was some reduction in the on-net rates, cross-network rates remain, we believe, disproportionately high, well above cost for well over a decade. And so you might say, well, costs on that side of the mobile business remain high. Well, there was the landline business, right? It was slightly less competitive, though highly regulated, and it had considerably lower rates than the mobile sector. So the idea is mobile rates were high. There's always the landline, except obviously that there was an incredible, and has been and continues to be a fairly relentless mobile substitution activity. So that today, the number one choice for communication are mobile phones. If you look at internet penetration, competition obviously followed liberalization, and it resulted in significant reductions both in price. People got higher speeds, more bandwidth. However, internet penetration is woefully low. Still, even after liberalization. I was at a government forum we hosted earlier this week, and the Minister of STEM, Minister Paulwell, pointed out to me after I made a similar point about the woefully low internet penetration levels, pointed to his smartphone and showed me an article that said 1.5 million people in Jamaica had been exposed to the internet. Pointed out to him that a lot of that exposure comes through smartphones and mobile data, and really involves interaction with Facebook and Twitter. That's not the kind of internet penetration I'm talking about. I'm talking about residential internet penetration, which is what the World Bank and the UN and other studies have found has a huge impact on GDP growth. And the GDP growth connection isn't about interacting with Facebook and Twitter. It's about getting internet into the homes where children can study and research, which is the #1 use of internet in homes right now. Kids use them to study, do homework, do research. That's where you create the linkages to GDP growth, and that is what we need to advance, and that, I believe, is something regulators can help enhance the advancement of internet penetration in the homes. Liberalization alone hasn't done that, and won't, frankly. So the scenario obviously stimulates the question, does liberalization always result in lower prices and better service? My view is obviously that this depends, and depends on many factors, including the type of market and the socio-economic environment in which the market operates. The answer may also vary between whether we're talking about electricity, water, or we're talking about the telecommunications markets. My comments are going to relate to the telecommunications business, since I'm neither a water nor electricity expert. Safe to say that I'm very pleased that following the passage of Hurricane Sandy, both of these critical utilities have been restored to me. So liberalization, frankly, can't be an end in and of itself. Simply allowing new entrants into what was formerly a monopoly market does not automatically mean that the resulting structure will lead to both lower prices and better service. Instead, these outcomes are only sustainably achieved by attaining true competition in a marketplace. And since perfect competition won't naturally occur, it's the legal and regulatory framework, I believe, that is going to ensure that level playing field, and probably has more to do with the commercial outcomes of businesses than anything else, that level playing field I'm talking about. Because that affords competing companies the same opportunity to operate a sustainably profitable business. An effective legal and regulatory framework ensures that dominant players, as occur from time to time, are denied the opportunity to abuse that dominant position to the detriment of smaller, weaker players, whether in the wholesale or retail markets. So in the absence of an appropriate legal and regulatory environment, competition is going to always be compromised. And unless the necessary intervention from the legislators and the regulators is effected in a timely manner, the market is going to suffer from lessening competition and perhaps a return to the monopoly market, to a monopoly market. So let's consider briefly what's occurred in Jamaica. And here, I'm going to try to be as passionate and as independent as I can possibly be. No, trust me, I'm going to be. The Telecoms Act was passed into law in 2000. And it was supposed to have liberalized the market in a three-phase process. Statute was intended to be amended within 3 years. It was not. And again, not for a lack of trying. The fixed line business, however, was vigorously and comprehensively regulated. Retail prices and the formula for arriving at them were fairly tightly prescribed. Mobile side of the market, we introduced the calling party pays regime, which had an impact on customer experience and customer service. However, on the mobile side, other than regulating fixed to mobile rates, it remained largely unregulated. Cross-network rates were set really high at $18 per minute at peak time and $15.80 off-peak time. And fact of the matter is, while I wasn't there, I have to admit that we were probably both complicit in arriving at those rates. Probably because, and I know I'm going to be strangled by my team for admitting this, but probably because at the time, as the sole provider and market leader, we believed that cross-network prices like this would ensure our market leadership, or hoped it would, going forward. However, and again, in fairness to our competition, the liberalization definitely assisted customer experience and service. And the innovations brought to the market by the competition at the time definitely improved for the average mobile phone subscriber, definitely improved service. Cannot disavow that. 24-hour contact centers, per second billing, multiple pricing plans, all introduced a customer experience that frankly was sadly lacking at the time. So I'll have to admit that liberalization from a mobile standpoint in and of itself definitely improved service. And accordingly, the company that eventually dominated the market innovated in the area of service. The challenge, though, is that the pernicious effects of a monopoly are agnostic to how you arrive at that monopoly position. So whether it's by fiat, government fiat, or you do it through commercial means, still has a pernicious effect on creating competition and improving not just service, but pricing as well. So this is what happens in the context of liberalizing a market, but operating it for a long period of time with outdated legislation and regulation. Companies can become dominant even through commercial means, and they have to be consistently and constantly regulated accordingly. The rest, as they say, is history. We've added an additional player in the mobile market through America Mobile and Claro, who increased, I would say, the bank accounts of our advertising agencies quite a bit, TV stations and the press, but didn't do a whole lot for bringing prices down. In their infinite wisdom, however, Digicel and Claro decided to merge. And the merger heightened the awareness, thankfully, of what was an unlevel playing field in the telecommunications market, despite liberalization. So in May of this year, amendments were finally passed to the Telecoms Act, and here I have to stop again and thank Minister Powell for the tireless work that him and indeed his government did in, first of all, recognizing that this was a path that we needed to continue going down, and finally arriving at the actual legislation that empowered our regulator to indeed act, and indeed ZIA and the OUR have to be congratulated on acting when receiving that power. Because the fact of the matter is the significant reduction in rates that have been achieved are a result of this legislative and regulatory framework. And indeed, the work continues because a lyric model is now going to produce what we hope will be final termination rates. Again, moving down this continuum of an evolving legislative and regulatory environment. We were put in a position now not just to step up our game from a service standpoint, but we introduced our famous now, should be famous now, Talk Easy plan with its historically low $2.99 per minute rates for prepaid customers and $1.99 per minute rates for postpaid customers, not just on our network, but internationally as well to the US, Canada, and to UK landlines. We managed to sign up well over 100,000 new subscribers in less than 100 days. And again, not trying to toot my horn, but just to refute the earlier argument by Mr. Khan that legislative activity is absolutely critical to the smooth functioning of commercial markets. And I just want to segue back to the question of service again. Last week we were ravaged by what has become Superstorm Sandy. And consumers, I think rightfully, have a high expectation that despite fallen trees and all of the ravages of a really savage hurricane, they expect, and being without electricity and water, they expect to continue to be able to contact family and friends, update their statuses on Facebook, tweet, send Facebook messages and BB messages. And with consumers holding us to this high standard, we're proud to say that we were able to be, we believe, a shelter in that storm. And we've continued to fairly, we believe, quickly restore the majority of our customers who lost service back to functioning service. Again, all part of this process of creating this competitive environment that focuses not just on better prices, but delivering a quality and improving service to our customers. Liberalization and the facilitation of true competition with effective regulation obliges operators to not only give good service and better prices, but to innovate as well. Our internet speeds, frankly, are comparable to first world countries today. And Jamaica boasts all of the latest telecommunications devices. However, in order to ensure this level playing field, we're going to have to continue to evolve, continue to innovate, if we hope for consumers to experience both lower prices and continuing to get better services. So we need to talk about stuff like infrastructure sharing as well. And here I'm talking about the co-location of cell towers. This needs to be prescribed and regularized. This is going to ensure that competing operators are given an equal opportunity to build out networks right across the country, especially given the scarcity of appropriate land space and the potentially negative effects on the environment of multiple operators building multiple towers in the same areas dotted across our beautiful island. So I obviously believe that the mandatory sharing of cell towers will lead to better overall cell coverage and ultimately better service to subscribers within our country. I'm also pleased to see that the local number portability, the LNP consultation process, is commencing in earnest. LNP is going to enable customers to choose a service provider now without the penalty, and that's what it is, the penalty of losing their number. And it facilitates value and quality being the basis of competition among operators, and not feeling trapped because, oh, that number I have is a number that is my identity and I don't want to lose it. In this way, once we get LNP done, and it's going to be a process that is going to take some commercial and hard commercial negotiations between us and our competitors in order to get, but I think we're both committed to getting it done. We get it done and consumers are going to win. And they're going to benefit from improved quality of service, products, and service innovation. I do have a concern though, and that is with the allocation and assignment of electromagnetic spectrum. Spectrum makes the provision of the various wireless services used through your cell phone, your various tablets, your iPad, your USB modems. It makes it possible for signals to be transmitted between those devices. And an inadequate amount of spectrum, or none of a particular type of spectrum, results in poor service delivery or the absence of services completely. And these services obviously are required to improve productivity within our country. Our legal and regulatory framework needs to ensure that spectrum is allocated appropriately and assigned fairly to operators such that they can improve service delivery. Again, I have to hark back to the merger of my previous two competitors and mention that despite liberalization, it's resulted in line being locked out of competing for additional 850 spectrum, which it absolutely requires to provide improved mobile broadband service to its customers. And here, the example of El Salvador, I think, is instructive, where regulators required Claro to give up some of its assigned spectrum as a prerequisite to approving the merger between Digicel and Claro in that country. On the table now is the proposed assignment of 700 megahertz spectrum for the provision of high-speed LTE services, high-speed video, downloading of data at really, really fast speeds. LTE services are going to deliver better wireless broadband services and will better meet the needs of an increasingly demanding consumer base. The appropriate policy making and consultation process, we implore you to put in place to ensure that all operators are able to compete fairly for this new LTE 700 megahertz spectrum. Of course, competition in the domestic market is affected by what happens in global markets as well. Economic issues, GDP, exchange rate movements, consumer demand all affect market players and impact prices and services. Small island states like ours, the cost of services, because the networks on which all of this traffic runs cost the same anywhere in the world you put them. Obviously, due to the lack of scale on small islands like ours, the per capita cost of that infrastructure may result in prices naturally that are higher than they need to be, even in a liberalized and competitive market. It's the challenge of being a small island state and lacking scale. So back in the days when we only had a single provider, I'm sure most of you were part of the movement that said the industry needed to be liberalized so that we'd have the full benefits of a competitive market, like citizens in most developed countries. I was certainly one of these people, wasn't always here, that anxiously awaited liberalization. However, now, long gone are the days when academics, and we heard it earlier, and policymakers felt that industries such as telecoms and others which are subject to huge investments in infrastructure and strong economies of scale of production, could be and should be considered natural monopolies. Gone are those days. Today, I think we accept, in principle, that liberalization with the objective of promoting competition is best for consumers and companies alike. Such an approach will enhance consumer choice, as I've said, and incentivize, more importantly, incentivize companies to innovate and operate efficiently and effectively so as to win more customers and to stay in business. So again, does market liberalization always result in lower prices and better service for consumers? Liberalization is a necessary but insufficient step to achieving both lower prices, to always achieving both lower prices and better services. To achieve both of these desirable outcomes, there must also exist an appropriate legal and regulatory framework that facilitates true competition. Example, a level playing field. So, we should consider liberalization the highway down which we're traveling, while a sound legal and regulatory framework are the critical road signs and traffic lights. With a sophisticated, technically competent, and well-armed with the proper legislative support regulator as the traffic cops. Operators will then be left to drive the vehicle of competition and commercial activity in a fair and transparent manner, and those able to provide value, great service, and innovation are going to survive and even thrive. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've had 3 interesting presentations. We have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. There's a mic in the center of the room. If you have any questions, comments, we invite you to make them now.
So, no, I don't think there was necessarily a feeling in the legislation. I think that the legislations that had been put in place was solid. There were obviously some enforcement challenges. I think our regulator will agree that they'd been deprived of, that I presume with the current amendments they've been afforded now, that is going to add teeth to regulate. You can't have a traffic cop who can't get a ticket. He's of no use. So as the traffic cop, he needed to be able to issue tickets. I think he has the ability now to do that, he being the regulator. So I think we're headed down a regulatory and legislative path that is robust and sound, having provided the regulator with and arming them with the ability to really police the industry, make prescriptions, and enforce them. So that's what I think had been lacking in the past. There was too much of an ability to frustrate the intention of the regulator, and that happened. I think we will all freely admit, or I hope we'll freely admit it, and I think that ability has been taken away now largely, and so we're going, I think, enter an era now of way more robust legislation and the ability of the regulator to enforce whatever it is that they prescribe.
I didn't really disagree with that point because it's basically what I was saying. I was saying that the regulators didn't have a role, but that the policymakers who would be legislators, those are the people who had the role. So we really didn't disagree as much as he thought we disagreed. Because that was the point I was making, not the regulators, because the regulators work within the legislation. And I was saying it was the policymakers who are the ones that formed the legislation that had the role in bringing about the environment for competition.
Okay. The point I was trying to make about cross-network termination rates being high and us both being complicit in establishing them originally was that when you have cross-network, networks need to be able to call one another. That's a critical aspect of running a sort of nationwide network. You need to be able to call across networks. Indeed, it was why at the time when we were the sole provider, our fixed lines were as tightly regulated as they were, because they really constituted the network of the day. And the idea was this then fledgling new upstart would have been starved of revenue if we made it prohibitively expensive for everybody on our huge fixed network to call across to this fledgling new upstart network. We'd have starved them of cross-network revenue, and you can't build a network by just talking to everybody on it when you start with 1, 2, 3 people. I needed to be able to cut. So that's why our fixed line was as heavily regulated as it was, because you wanted to prevent that. Now, obviously, time don't stand still. And what occurred, as I readily admitted, largely through a lot of the commercial innovation and the customer experience innovation that our competition engaged in, the mobile business became the dominant network and was dominated by the competition. And all I was trying to say was that the regulation needs to keep up. Can't just stay stuck in the way it was 10 years ago. And I think your question was, well, yeah, but if everybody's happy and everybody's making money, the problem though is not going to be sustainable for the consumer. The consumer is not going to be a sustainable business, and we're not going to have market competition, and we're not going to be able to create the environment for innovation and continually improving customer experience in an environment where there's a single huge dominant player with traffic only occurring and moving on their network. If you're not regulated properly, bring cross-network rates down to a point where it's roughly approximates the cost of actually terminating that traffic, so that customers are agnostic as to where they're calling from or to, as it is in first world countries. You don't think about, oh, I'm on T-Mobile, I'm calling a Verizon customer now, or I'm calling an AT&T customer now, because they have advanced termination rate regimes and environments. That's where we have to get to, because then all you compete on is how well I take care of you and the prices that I charge you and the innovation I give you in order to make your life easier.
Before Dr. Jefferson comes in here, I'd just like to point out you have to be careful about your cross-country comparisons. What you seem to be getting at is you're looking at the market structures and say that if we have similar market structures, we ought to have similar prices. But the input costs might be different. The fuel costs in one country for electricity might be very different from the fuel costs in another country. So even if the market structures are the same, do not be surprised if you have different outcomes. Dr. Jefferson.
Right. I think the point is a good one, that we would oftentimes expect in a duopoly situation, or it could happen at more firms, in telecommunications, where the networks do interconnect, that call termination is not a very competitive market. Yeah, you can try to take the customer, but in that process, in that dynamic process, generally the termination prices stay fairly high. And that means the retail prices stay fairly high. That is a natural market dynamic. And so the question is, what do you do in that situation? That is the role of the regulator, and to try to establish more cost-based termination prices, so that then gives us the retail competition that we'd be looking for. I don't know how that works in any particular country. I know a lot about different countries, but not a lot about any specific one. The role of who can be the troublemaker to kind of entice the process, that's part of what you're doing. You're prodding the process here a little bit and saying, well, I see these things in other countries. Why isn't that true here? And maybe there are very good reasons why it's not true, but maybe not. Until someone is raising those challenges and pointing to the data and saying someone should look at this, oftentimes we don't get it. Take, for example, another, and the troublemaker may be a new entrant of some sort as well. For example, in one of the other African countries, down on fixed fixed wireless, they had like 8 players. Prices were high, penetration was very low. They licensed the 9th player. The 9th player said, I don't think prices should be that high. And they dropped their own prices, and that made everybody's prices go down, and the system changed. It's just somebody to break the rules is enough sometimes to perturb the system and let it work.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, but we have to keep the conference overall on track, and we're out of time. I'd like to thank very much the panelists. I'm sure you can ask further questions in the coffee break, etc.
The panel, and actually I will ask the panel to introduce themselves so that they can do a better job than myself. My name is Giorgio Valentini. I'm the country manager for the World Bank, based here in Jamaica, representing Jamaica, but also Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, Guyana, and that's it. So, Michelle?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle English. I'm the President and Chief Operating Officer with Columbus Communications Jamaica Limited. We're the operators of the Flow brand and the Columbus Business Solutions brand here in Jamaica and in the region.
Morning, I'm Reginald Budan, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Industry, Investment and Commerce.
Hi, I'm Kelly Tomlin, President and CEO of JPS.
Good morning, Gladstone Hutchinson, Director General, Planning Institute of Jamaica.
Thank you, everyone. So basically, the panel will make some short presentations in terms of investing in utilities infrastructure. And some of us maybe will provide some linkages with the competitiveness agenda of the country, some others more details in terms of the regulations. So we'll try to be brief, and we will welcome your questions at the end. So let me start with mine, and let me see if, okay. So let me start by saying that, there is a need for rethinking the strategies in any country. And as you know, now there is not just the global connectivity that they all talk about, but, there is also the local connectivity. So if we look right now, everything is on the cloud. I mean, we talk about cloud computing, we talk about connecting everyone, and connection is not just about through submarine cables, but it's also right now Wi-Fi. So we can say that, we are all basically up in the sky in terms of learning how to connect globally. But there is also the issue of local connectivity. Local connectivity basically is how we can improve the environment around us and connect all the various networks, not just the utilities one, but the transport, the education, everything else. So the interconnection, the local connectivity connection is increasingly more relevant to the global connectivity one. And, sorry, my password. So now if we go on competitiveness, the competitiveness agenda is very key. I want to make the point over here that competitiveness is key for utilities infrastructure investments, because you cannot really compete unless you have a good environment there. So many countries really focus very much on exporting primary goods instead of focusing more in exporting value-added goods. And that, of course, require a different type of environment and frameworks. But also the issue of competitiveness is that many countries still work with the old, nice equipment. It works well, it's very nice, but it cannot compete with the new models. And I think that this is also the interest in looking at the regulation in terms of how can you improve that environment in terms of bringing the new to the old. Productivity is another important aspect in terms of improving competitiveness, but also put a lot of strains in terms of the infrastructure as well. As we know very well, I mean, productivity is, is a factor of people. I mean, we have Steve, Tom, and other two people working there. But today, what we have is the robot. He will basically be all those 4 people plus more, but he doesn't take bathroom breaks, and he also maybe come in different colors. This is basically the new productivity framework that has been learned by many countries, including China, including many others. So the increase in robotics all over the world is astonishing, but that requires a different kind of investments in the infrastructure framework. And if you see, robotization right now is very pervasive in any industries today. Digital society, even more important in terms of the global connectivity. So how do we basically move towards a digital society? The youth are the clear example. I mean, the youth basically, right now, they teach us how to interconnect in many different ways. For people like me, I still need to print out everything, and otherwise, it's very difficult for me to understand if I make mistakes or not. For them, they can use just the digital format. I mean, if you ask them what is paper, probably they don't even know. In Japan, they're very focused on integrating the man with the machine. It's maybe a stretch. I would not like to be a robot, but many people are thinking how to give them more intelligence, and that's kind of scary. But that's the way, that's the trend. For example, in Korea, they moved They moved out from the building a knowledge society. Now they want to build a ubiquitous society. The ubiquitous society basically is a society in which everything that we touch and interact with is an embedded computer chip. Scary thoughts. You will never be alone any longer, and everybody will know where you are. Paperless. Basically, a paperless environment will be the one that the digital society will bring, but also cashless. So no longer cash. Embarking in a digital society type of environment, it will require lots of investments, especially infrastructure. Growth. Growth is another theme that everybody talks about. There are different ways of measuring growth. At the World Bank, we have so many different measures of growth that every time that we do a report, we argue almost ourselves, which one is better. To me, I have one that I think that is very valuable. It never fails. Just look up at the sky and see how many construction cranes there are. That tells you if a country is growing or not. Jamaica wants to embark more in the logistics arena, and I think that they have a strong potential because they're really outside the Panama Canal, and they're really doing some work right now in terms of engaging and also preparing for the post-Panamax in a few years. And of course, logistics will bring different stress on the utilities infrastructure because, as you can see, ports, they have a lot of different needs compared to cities, but also the airfield, Vernam airfield, that's been discussed as becoming airlifting hub for Jamaica. But also manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing, they will put another stress on the investment on the current infrastructure and also bring new potential investments. Medical tourism is another area that the government is looking at, and I think that will be interesting to see how this also will add to the mix and see what the utilities infrastructure needs will be required in the next 5 years. So talking about the infrastructure, I think that it's important to understand that the various networks, water, electricity, and other ones, right now are kind of looked into as silos. And we can see that in many countries right now they're embarking in investing more in the smart grid that is not just the electricity but also the various networks and their connectivity amongst themselves, and especially the interoperability, bringing the interoperability. So to have really a smart grid that is really smart in terms of monitoring the efficiency at certain points, it basically brings the demand when needed. The alternative energy, that's part of the mix. Alternative energy in many countries is basically aimed at being about 20–30% of the overall energy supply. In many countries, like you can see in Europe, solar panels are everywhere, on the highways, parking lots, everywhere. But also there is a need to look at the efficiencies. So regulation should not be just about the typical regulation of infrastructure, but also in terms of building codes. In the US, there is the LEED certification, and that one is the World Bank, one of the World Bank buildings that is platinum LEED certified, and it's highly efficient. You have one over here also, I think, with Digicel, and I think that is also an important aspect of regulation, because you can improve what you already have, and also you can improve your building codes in order to accommodate the future needs. I'm always surprised when sometimes I go to new buildings and you see those little windows. I mean, you have lots of light. Why do you want little windows in the little windows where we basically will bring the need for light? Bringing efficiencies also means, for example, looking at what is available. Since I come here, I always see that around 5:30, 6 o'clock is always dark. Why not look into the daylight 7 hours? Because when I'm in the office, I turn on the lights at 6 o'clock. That can be a saving if basically dark will come at 7. So there are different ways of measuring efficiencies in terms of energy, but also in terms of water and other type of networks. But all of this, it's important because you are in an island that is very much on the path of many hurricanes. So building and thinking about climate resilient infrastructure is very key. So as you can see, in many countries all over the world, they all suffer about climate change, and in Jamaica more so, even though that you fare very well, I think, during Hurricane Sandy, and because think here cost, so far the estimated cost is about 50 million US. In the US it's 50 billion, so it's a big leap. And I think that, the only few issues, of course, were with the utilities in terms of the water. Maybe that's why it's on house in the US to tell you about building codes, building with the wood instead of steel and concrete. But utility poles are really the one that they made the mark over here in Jamaica, but also in the US. But also I saw that there were disruptions in terms of water networks because of the poor construction of those networks as well. So when we go in terms of the policies and investments, I mean, what is needed is really, we need to balance the need for the strong policies with the need for investments. I mean, all over the world, with the global connectivity, we are all moving very fast. We are moving very fast because, competitiveness is about no longer to have a 10 or 20-year plan for an industry. It's about adapting every day to the constant changes of the market. And the market itself is not any longer local, it's global. So if you compete on the local market, you will have little opportunities, and also there is very little for the economy to become competitive. So the balance is there. But also to move out from the old, like the static, like I was saying before. Why do we need to plan for 10 or 20 years in terms of policy regulations, when today everything changes very quickly? A shift in global demand, we can see right now. China was growing very fast, now it's slowing. Well, it's slowing, 7% GDP growth expected, 7.6. But still, because the decrease in demand that is affecting everyone, and those changes in demand can happen very quickly, very fast. So you need to adapt to that. So you can no longer really think about developing policy regulations for the next 20 years. You need to be flexible in your estimation, and also you need to be flexible in terms of adapting to the new demands. At the end, it's all about ICT. It's about broadband and ICT. If you look at the globally connected markets, the globally connected economies, societies, utilities network, any network, everything relies on becoming smarter in terms of embedding chips in those networks. And the only way that you have to control those networks is through ICT. So ICT should really be the most studied kind of a sector in terms of how the ICT can improve the interoperability amongst all these networks, and how can improve also the efficiencies by basically studying the supply and demand instantaneously, and then provide the input when it's needed. But basically the conclusion is very simple. I think that we need to cut the red tape. Cutting the red tape to me is about basically looking at the global expertise, looking at the flexibility in terms of changing demands, and basically adapting to that. Cutting the red tape also means that the quickness of reacting to that, because you can react to the shifting global demands, but then it will take time for approving. And that is not just about the OUR or anyone else. It's about every single citizen. It's about the civil society's body, the government, and everyone. Missing the call for competitiveness is high risky. And today, as you can see in Jamaica, there is very low ICT penetration in the system, meaning that many industries suffer from the lack of ICT. That's why productivity is low. And you can see our study that was done a year and a half ago, in which we see that productivity is low in Jamaica, not because of the low productivity of the people, the Jamaican people. It's because basically the lack of robotics, for example. The lack of ICT, for which basically can enable a better inventory management system, better basically management your supply and demand with your clients overseas. So, and at the end, by having very good regulations and policies in terms of utilities infrastructure, we'll also attract more businesses. Because at the end, that's what it is about. Many businesses will come to a country if they know that there is a very good environment for which they can do business. They want to come to a country, then have to worry about the water, the electricity, and everything else. I think that they want to come in and plug in right away and do business. I think that is maybe 20 years ago, that was the case in which the business was more involved in terms of also developing the infrastructure for utilities. But today, I think that with the increasing competition by many countries in providing those infrastructure already available to the investors, I think that Jamaica needs to think about how to create a space for those investments so that the investment from overseas, they can come in and plug in right in with the society. Thank you very much.
ICT and the development of that kind of infrastructure on economic development in a country. And it's widely recognized that, that investment in ICT generates economic growth. And in fact, just have some statistics there from the Global Information Technology Report in 2012, which was published by the World Economic Forum. And 10% of broadband penetration can grow GDP by 1%. Doubling of speeds can yield growth in excess of 0.3% of GDP. In terms of unemployment, an increase of 10% in digitization reduces a nation's unemployment rate by 0.84%. And in terms of innovation, a 10-point increase in innovation, in digitization, results in a 6-point increase in the country's score on the Global Innovation Index. So where are we today? We talked about, Giorgio talked about current penetration rates in Jamaica. Here's some information based on OUR reports from 2005. You see there's been growth, and the last 2012 numbers actually taken from the current census. And we're looking at 880,000 households, but of that group, only 246,000 actually have computers. And then of that group, 138,000 have a broadband connection. Still certainly a long ways to go in terms of penetration. Broadband speeds are a driver as well, as we saw. And looking at sort of where Jamaica and the Caribbean is in terms of the rest of the world, we're actually one of 4 countries in the Caribbean. The other 3 include flow territories of Trinidad, Curacao, and then the Dominican Republic as well, offer 100 megs to the home. And you can see the differences of what you can do and how quickly and how the impact on productivity by going from a 1 meg connection to a 100 meg connection. Just in terms of looking at downloading a high quality movie would take 8 hours and 40 minutes on a 1 meg connection and 5 minutes and 20 seconds on a 100 meg connection. So it's phenomenal the impact that increases in speeds and capacities deliver in terms of productivity. And really, I think we have to look at usage because there's really been a dramatic shift in consumer behavior in terms of how we use ICT and how we use the internet. And it's really been towards applications, real-time applications. We know on our network that the vast majority of usage comes from things like streaming, file sharing, and large-scale file transfers. And when you take a look back at those connection speeds, you can really see how the speeds make a difference in terms of enabling this kind of development. So demand for more and higher quality video, demand for higher quality rich content is really driving the demand for high capacity broadband access. And Flow, through our network, is enabling this. And in addition to that, we see applications like social media, which are connecting users, Web 2.0, collaborative kinds of applications, cloud-based services, as Giorgio talked about. All of these things are enabled by infrastructure investment. And in fact, the infrastructure investment then is driving that kind of innovation. So clearly, broadband growth and investment in infrastructure particularly is critical as a component of national growth. Excuse me, struggling with getting over the flu. So what do we need to encourage that kind of investment? Firstly, a market-led approach, which would be facilitated by an enabling policy environment, is critical. In a market-led approach, incentives need to be designed and given to rolling out infrastructure to ensure that telecom networks with high fixed costs extend beyond profitable urban areas to include rural communities. And in those kinds of things, regulation certainly matters as well, because differences in regulatory policies have have played a crucial role in country development. So countries that have tended to promote competition between different platforms, so encouraging investment in infrastructure, have typically done much better than countries that have focused on sort of service-based competition, where you have players coming in using the existing operators' infrastructure. You see less innovation and less development in those types of regulatory environments. We believe that effective regulation can promote development and effective competition, and in turn, effective competition should drive new investments, which further drives economic development. Just quickly, a couple of reports or analysis that support that. The ECTA in Europe economic analysis concluded that effective regulation did have a strong and positive impact on the level of investment in telecommunications and network services throughout the European Union. And the study clearly demonstrated that the higher the overall effectiveness of the regulator, the greater the investment. In Asia, particularly in Pakistan, they rated very high in areas around regulatory framework in terms of market entry, access to scarce resources, interconnection, tariff regulation, universal service obligations, and quality of service. And what happened in Pakistan is that they led the FDI in 2007-2008 for the country. There was 27% of all the country's FDI was in the ICT sector, over $1.4 billion in that particular period. So you can see how regulation can have a significant impact in attracting FDI and infrastructure investment. Of course, policy leadership is also critical for creating an enabling environment for broadband rollout and creating demand for additional national broadband networks. So those countries that have succeeded in rolling out an extensive broadband network have succeeded in rolling out applications and associated content and integrating them into their economic and social fabric, have really done so, not necessarily because there's been vast wealth associated in those countries or even great investments, but it's really been on the basis of strong private sector participation, which has been facilitated by early and consistent prioritization of broadband at every level of policymaking. So will an economic boost inevitably follow a telecom infrastructure investment? Well, not necessarily, because clearly it doesn't operate in a vacuum. Things like establishing plans and policies to guide deployment and provide leadership support, promoting competition, providing government funding through private-public partnerships, putting in place strategies to make broadband services more available and useful to consumers, providing digital literacy training, partnering with stakeholders, and so on, are all important aspects of policymaking that will contribute to the growth of investment in the ICT area. Of course, the physical transport layer in a backbone network, as we look at sort of the types of applications, clearly is a critical component. We have to have sufficiently fast data speeds to ensure that developing countries can participate in the digital revolution and reap full benefits of the technological progress. So policies that drive investment in high-capacity next-generation networks are really critical. Broadband networks and the internet are transforming the nature of innovation. So you have creative individuals out there now who can sort of acquire knowledge and skills remotely over the internet. Innovation is becoming increasingly dominated by content, user-generated content, things like crowdsourcing, and really sort of simply, the strength of an idea. And as such, investing in broadband is not necessarily just an investment in infrastructure. We have to look at it as a bigger picture than that. It's an investment in people. And for broadband, is really part of it's an investment in an interconnected sort of world of ideas. And that can spread from one side of the world to another in a matter of seconds now because of the kind of infrastructure that's in place. So investing in people and in their ideas really contributes more to empowering and making progress in global development agenda than really virtually anything else that policymakers can do. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon. when Zia invited me, I think it was invitation, but regulators rarely ask, I was excited to be a part of this panel. Little did we all know what a backdrop that we would have to discuss both sustainable development and investment in utility infrastructure. The devastation that we've seen both in Jamaica and throughout the Bahamas and Cuba and the U.S. is going to put a pressure on that investment, as we now see that billions and billions of U.S. dollars will have to be invested in a short time. And I don't think I can move forward mentally without saying a few words about the hurricane. At one point we had 480,000 people without power. Today we do have 30,000 people still without power. And as I drove from Kingston over through Stony Hill and down through Junction, over to Portmore and down through St. Thomas and Morant Bay and back to Kingston, you know, I was not shocked, but certainly depressed about the level of devastation that I saw. About 300 poles in one parish need to be replaced. So that's going to put an immediate need for utility infrastructure upon us. And I think as we sit back and talk about the word sustainable development and utility infrastructure, this very real backdrop has us ask a couple of questions. And the first one does relate to a highly controversial topic around climate change. I don't think we have to be on one side or the other, but I think we do have to ask the question, are storms going to be more frequent? Does that have an impact on the need for utility infrastructure or the need for different utility infrastructure? And if it does, what are some solutions from a regulatory perspective? One of which, of course, is some accelerated depreciation for a pole replacement program. Perhaps we could have stronger regulation for vegetation management for property owners, and a number of other things have come to at least my attention. One suggestion was around underground facilities. Perhaps there's a way we could use our disaster relief fund for an increased investment in underground facilities. But I think the overall question for us today in light of the hurricane, does it make a difference that we are subject to hurricanes, or a weather event can cause such havoc in the way we do infrastructure planning? With that backdrop, I will talk just briefly about the drivers for both utility investment and sustainable development. The first of which is demand. And as we look globally, we expect about a 2.4% increase globally in the demand for electricity and therefore infrastructure. In developing countries, it's up to 4%. And if you think of China, that really drives the need and the competition for utility infrastructure. Here, of course, we're facing something a little different, but that will still put an upward demand on the cost of infrastructure short term because of the utility situation that we're going to face now from the hurricane, but really long term, if in fact you expect this to continue to 2030, when they look at a need for 10 trillion US dollars in infrastructure investment. So number one, demand. Number two, cash. Fortunately, with that demand, there's an abundance of cash. Hedge funds have it. I think some of my U.S. friends have it because they keep coming to visit me, asking me, you know, is there a way to invest? Hedge funds have it. The good news, too, is that today, from a generation perspective, it's a good time to build. There's a downward pressure in the generation on OPEX, CapEx. So that's good news. The bad news for us is that we look at fuel, we're seeing an upward pressure on futures. So that's one factor, too, on the need for sustainable development. The third one, and everyone's mentioned it, but I cannot not mention it, is investor confidence. And it's really coming home to us every day, and how do we drive investor confidence? I don't want to be repetitive, but I think I do have to outline regulatory certainty, and regulatory certainty. And in addition, this one for Jamaica in particular, political consistency. I think it really is sending a conflicting message when we try to do one without the other. And third, judicial and overall fairness and equity. Those three parts of a pie really create the foundation for investment. Because when you think about the need for 10 trillion US dollars, we're in competition for those dollars. Interestingly, I just left the conference next door, that is put on by our Korea partners. And they're talking about how to invest more wisely and how they can invest in Jamaica. And I think it's important for us from a social and layman perspective to continue to talk about it. Because as I walk around Jamaica, I get this all the time about foreigners taking over Jamaica. And I do try to explain that in the U.S. we're owned basically by the British, the Japanese, and a lot of different countries, and that foreign investment is a good thing. So I think, for lack of a better word, emotionally, there's a component that is important for sustainable development and utility infrastructure investment. The one that's been mentioned a lot is technology. In the room next door, I just heard that I could get polls for half price here, so we're going to see if that's really true. But as we continue to think about it, I always tell the joke that Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison came back from the past and came to the future. They walked into a room. Alexander Graham Bell picked up the phone. He was so confused, he couldn't use it. Thomas Edison sat down, he felt right at home. There is some truth to that. Technology hasn't moved as fast in our industry, but we're seeing that now. And changing technology will form, I think, the basis for increased infrastructure investment going forward. And what else is important as we talk about sustainable development? I try to call this at JPS as, facing the hard facts, really getting real about what's possible and what is not possible, and facing truth, really hard truth, and speaking the truth. And you'll hear me talk a lot about it in various functions and formats, this need for the hard, cold truth. The truth is we're facing a weak economy. The truth is that I have 800,000 consumers, as I just saw from the census, and 560,000 customers. That's a great divide. And Zia's sick of hearing this topic, but I couldn't go forward without mentioning it. But it does put a pressure on the need or the availability for investment dollars from the utility, who is the backbone for investment currently. We face a lack of growth. We face the need for energy efficiency measurements, which therefore puts a decrease on the utility usage, and it's very appropriate. So a regulatory answer may be decoupling as you try to pursue two goals of maintaining a not bankrupt utility and really promoting something that's really important for us for the next 3 years at least and forever is energy efficiency. Estimates are right now that we could save 20% just by energy efficiency. And it's not getting the momentum that one would think. Practically, even though we're talking about it a lot, I went to a conference on energy efficiency, and the promoter told me that he had Trinidadians in the room and Jamaicans in the room, and we all know what the price is in Trinidad, significantly lower than Jamaica. And they came up with a program for these businesses to go back and do these energy efficiency measures. And when we reviewed them 3 months later, everybody in Trinidad had done theirs, nobody in Jamaica had done theirs. So we have to really probe, why we continue to chase something that's very, very difficult and very, very necessary, fuel diversity, when we do have a solution that is at our hands. So really facing what's possible, facing what's immediate, and continuing to pursue what we all know we need while we do today what's immediately in front of us. And the last two things I'd like to mention before we move on to the panel is this long-term focus. I know it's been said, but I think it needs to be repeated, that utility infrastructure requires significant investment. Jamaica needs, again, I must say it, $1 billion US today for its infrastructure. And that long-term focus can't be jarred by short-term priorities or short-term actions. We need to be able to think 20, 30, 40 years and stick with our thought on it. That's difficult to do, to stay the course when a lot of things come jarring us, but it's important for sustainable development. And finally, I would suggest, after listening to some of my colleagues, that really let's not get all fall in love with a particular market approach. Because if we really agree on a goal, I would say may not any, but many market approaches work. And I'll give you some examples. Think of Canada. Ontario decided they had a goal, renewable development. It was not low-cost energy. It was renewable development. It was also some jobs programs. So they had a feed-in tariff, and that's a particular goal and a particular regulatory response to that goal. So the feed-in tariff had solar at 43 cents, had wind at 13.5, and my prior company, one of the world's largest energy companies, ran to Canada all day long to get that. And then they turned it into a jobs program, because not only in addition to an initial domestic quantity, you had to have so much of your infrastructure from domestic sources, they started to increase that. So you saw something different happening. You saw the suppliers and manufacturers run to Ontario. So that's a particular goal that a group agreed on, like they do in Boulder, Colorado, like they do in Austin, Texas, and they moved to that particular regulatory response. And then if you also look at the US, you will see different market mechanisms that have resulted in sustainable development and the required investment. You look at Texas, that is a totally, I don't like to use the word non-regulated because it doesn't exist in the world where utilities are concerned. But they have a system where the utilities were forced to separate all their functions, the T, the D, and so on and so forth, and couldn't be owned by a common owner. They have an energy-only market. They have found a way by have scarcity pricing, meaning that on the hot days of the year, the price goes through the roof, to incent investment. That's their model. It's very different than the Northeast or the Mid-Atlantic, the PJM model, where they've decided a capacity market is the regulatory response that will promote investment. And it's very different than most of the rest of the US, which today still maintains a monopoly model. They've found a way from a regulatory and tariff perspective to invest and to incent investment. So there's lots of different models. I would just encourage us to agree on what our priorities are, because it's really hard to do 5 things that are somewhat contradictory all at once and really move toward that. And just remember that the backbone always is a strong regulatory format. Thank you very much.
Well, it's interesting to see from the presentation of Michelle and Kelly the focus on the long term. I think that this is a focus that is needed in order to achieve what was discussed before, not just about the increase in GDP if you bring more innovation and broadband into the country, but also in terms of if you bring more utilities infrastructure into the country. As Michelle said, I think that there is a need to improve that. For example, in terms of the broadband, in terms of the ICT, make it much more capillary around the country, but also in society to improve those investments. Of course, regulation is key. A knowledge society, ubiquitous society like Korea, it was not born in 1 year. They started in 1960. So that was their focus. And their focus is not over. So they're still focusing on the next 10 or 20 years, and they're building on that. What Kelly mentioned is very critical. Cash. There is lots of liquidity all over the world, but you need to compete for the liquidity. And liquidity only comes in countries if they have a very good regulatory framework. The judicial system is very key. At the World Bank, we say that maybe we need to break it down into 3 different areas. I mean, the overall governance framework, the overall competitiveness framework, but also the social framework. All those 3 are very much interlinked. You cannot have one without the other. And I think it's very desirable to have all 3 basically come up, not at the same time, but maybe at different speed, but with the same objective. So I think that sustainable development again in Jamaica can happen, but the focus on the long-term goals in terms of bringing more equity into the system, participation. As Kelly mentioned, to have 800,000 families and 560,000 customers, I mean, it tells you that something in the system needs to be adjusted. And this is basically not just for the electricity, it's for everything else. The robotic side. why are people still focusing on maintaining the old car or maintaining the old building and being basically still using the old infrastructure to generating some income, knowing that the new one will make them more competitive. So maybe it's a time for thinking about the cultural shift, and I think I'm very glad that the two private sector representatives that they highlight those two items. So now I will leave it to the government, and I will ask Reginald, the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Industry, Investment and Commerce, to give us his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen at the head table and in the audience, good afternoon. First, let me start by apologizing for the absence of Minister Hilton, who should have been here to address you. As some of you may be aware, Minister Hilton was once Minister of Energy, and that is something that is very close to his heart because he spent a fair amount of time understanding the business and does have thoughts and views on the matter. However, he's traveling, and so I'm substituting almost at the last minute. So you will not get Minister Hilton's perspective. I have, for my contribution here, I have two questions to ask. But before I ask the two questions, I want to make some general remarks to provide context. We have here today a very experienced group of professionals discussing a very important and complex matter of regulating utilities for sustainable development. I want to focus a little bit, I want to focus my brief remarks on electricity. The modern world, of course, has now come to accept electricity as almost taking it for granted. Every day a new gadget comes out which uses more power. From the Ministry of Industry's point of view, we find ourselves almost in a position of conflict of interest. Because on one hand, we are responsible for investment, and therefore we have to encourage and promote investment in various fields, including utilities. Of course, we also have responsibility for consumers. And somehow there's this tension between the two. We have been experiencing some challenges recently, as you are all aware. Every time our producers or manufacturers get together, they identify one problem as the reason why they're not competitive, even though we know that there are many others. And that one is electricity. What doesn't help our cause is that our main competitor has a very low electricity cost. And so the view is that we are uncompetitive because of electricity. We're not denying that. Electricity is almost like interest rate. It's a constant across businesses. And I would say more so for the manufacturing sector and tourism, probably more than others because they consume a significant amount of electricity. So we have an interest in ensuring that there is enough generating capacity in the country, that there is enough investment to ensure that generating capacity and reserve requirement. The question is, how do you attract that investment? The points noted a while ago about good regulatory environment and so on are very critical. Because investment dollars, in as much as so much investment dollars are out there, and under globalization, capital is free to move globally. FDI will only move to your territory if it will earn the level of return that is competitive for risk. And, well, I suppose that says it all, because investors are balancing rate of return and risk. They do not want low rate of return for high risk. So if they perceive their environment to be risky, you're not going to be able to attract them. Now, we have another dimension, another challenge in attracting investment. Somehow, the Jamaican investment environment has not been as, I would say, as good as many others in terms of the rate of return that we get. Because when you look at the investment made, the FDI in Jamaica, it is actually quite reasonable in terms of the Americas. But somehow we have not got the corresponding growth in GDP, as you all know. So it must be that somehow the investment is not yielding the kind of returns. Companies are not making the kind of profit, even though they make the investment. Now, that may be for various reasons, which I don't want to go into. But if companies are not able to make that kind of investment, both local and foreign, you're not going to be able to attract the FDI, maybe in the sectors especially that you need to attract it. A little bit about the utilities regulation side of things. Let me just up front say that we have seen an evolution in especially electricity market over the last 100 or so years. And, you know, maybe 50, 60 years ago, we come to recognize that there's something called natural monopolies, and therefore you give them monopoly rights, and therefore you have to regulate them when you give them all the market. In more recent times, we have come to see competition start developing in the generation market, and we're happy for that. And as you all know, anybody can now invest in the generation side of things. Distribution is of course, a monopoly. The challenge here, of course, is while we do have a competitive, I would say, a competitive market for generation, there's a high perception that electricity cost is high because of maybe the structure of the industry. Now, I don't want to pronounce on that, but I would want to say that even though we have started regulation of the industry maybe just about 15 years now, I still think there is enough of a high regard for our regulatory infrastructure and a certain level of and its professionalism. So the question that we may have to ask ourselves, is it that maybe cost is high, maybe because some of our generating capacity itself is highly inefficient and maybe we need to change them out? But of course, for us to change them out, we have to be able to attract investment. And somehow we have not been able to make that happen on a timely basis. In fact, in terms of where we are now, if we do not make significant investment, we are going to have problem in terms of reserve requirement, and we could be facing serious challenges in the future. So we need to make significant investment now in the very very near future. And of course, is that chicken and egg. People have to feel confident, and we have to be able to expedite the process. I must tell you that as far as JPS is concerned, I wouldn't like to be in JPS's shoes. It's not a very easy one. And Ms. Toblin, you may not know this, but I have a little secret which you don't know. And let me share it with you. One of the reasons why you were engaged to manage JPSCO in Jamaica is because, you know, Jamaicans like to demonstrate about power. Many of those demonstrators are women. So we put them in a position of conflict of interest. Part of the challenge, ladies and gentlemen, undoubtedly, and it's interesting when you hear the figures a while ago, non-technical losses is a major challenge for us. It's a serious challenge. And part of that may be low disposable income on the part of consumers. Consumers almost feel it's a right to have power. And maybe they don't understand that there's a cost of producing that power. So we are trapped into this situation where we have to provide power, and sometimes maybe we even ignore the non-technical losses, which add, of course, to the costs that we all bear. So that is something that we have to address as a country, as a nation, in the long run. Otherwise, and because people are not going to invest if they believe that the rate of return that they're making is not attractive and the environment is too risky. I wouldn't, if I were an investor, I would be very scared to be investing in a field whereby if I am to get a rate increase, which maybe a regulator may approve, there is going to be challenge over it. Maybe I should invest in another area where I'm free to increase my price, as the case might be. So it's a very challenging area, but it is important. And if we do not increase the generation capacity and ensure that we also have efficient distribution, transmission and distribution system, we will not have that the amount of power that we need to supply the country. And I wanted to turn to two hypothetical questions for you. And you're all very knowledgeable people, so and this is what you do, some of you, so you might be able to throw some light on it for me. And that is, the first one is, let us say we have, because I mentioned about this tension between the electricity providers and the consumers. And here you have consumers with low disposable income who almost feel that power is a right. Suppose, let's consider a situation where you have a country where distribution, transmission, and distribution are separate from generation. So we have competitive market for the generation side. And we have a reputable regulatory machinery which ensures that merit order dispatch works. And it's a kind of dispatch system that we could show, it's transparent. We, for that matter, could give you a website where you go there and you can see how the merit order, how the dispatch was made. So there's no question about the transparency of the system. Let's assume we have that. Would it be a way to resolve this tension and this conflict between the two? If, for example, you were to say to the consumers now, listen, you know something you're always complaining about, the power costs. We buy it from a competitive market, so you can't say we are generating inefficiently. The only part we are doing now is the distribution, the transmission and distribution. You take that. You own that. So if you are a consumer, you have to buy shares in that company. You own it. Now, in terms of dividends, you can take it one of two ways. You can take low dividends or no dividends and low electricity costs. Or you can take high dividends and pay high electricity costs. It's your choice. You decide. And you know what I will do? Instead of, since you may want to complain about the company's efficiency and so on, I will contract professional managers competitively to manage that system. And you have the right, the power, the authority to change them when you feel they're not acting to ensure that the system works efficiently. In which case you put the consumers in a position of conflict of interest. They have to decide whether they want cheap power and they pay for it, and cheap power and no dividends, or they want high power and high dividends. They decide. I'm just searching for a way to diffuse this conflict and for us to have a peaceful, harmonious system in the long run. So that's one question. I don't know the answer to it. I'm just throwing out that for you to reflect on. The second question I want to ask you, we all seem to agree that in the long run, fossil fuel will deplete. And presumably, as fossil fuel goes down, supply goes down, price is going to increase. And we all seem to agree that we have to switch to renewable energy. Would it be a good thing for, the next point I want to make is that Jamaicans like to build big houses. Some people say they even overcapitalize in the housing infrastructure in terms of size and so on. Other countries, I understand, like Hong Kong, they regulate size of your rooms, height, and all of those kinds of things. So you can only hold a certain amount of furniture. The rest of money you have, you better invest it. Would it be a good thing for us to say that if your consumption of electricity is above a certain ceiling, then you are required to invest in renewables? We will give you duty-free treatment on the equipment that you import, but in return for that duty-free that we are giving you, we have a share in your system. And so you must produce, say, 40, 50% more, or 40 to 50% of what you produce must go to the grid at a very low price, which can be used for one of two things. Maybe go to the to run our factories in the day, maybe bring down their costs, and also to the lower end of the income spectrum. And if we were to have a policy like that in place, would it lead to all the roofs we have across the country having solar panels and whatever technology come in the future? And since we're in a hurricane belt, design them in such a way that if a hurricane is coming, you can dismantle them and you can put them away safely. And when the storm is gone, you reinstall them. I don't know. I just put out that for you to consider. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I mean, it was an interesting presentation. I think he asked a lot of very good questions. And I think that, you know, especially the last one in terms of maybe having people become a generator of electricity, it's an interesting one. But I was struck by the comment that the PS made about people complaining about the high cost of electricity, especially from the private sector. And I think that that is one that many people in the private sector mention as one of the factors for hindering competitiveness, their competitiveness. I think I have a different view, and I think that, you know, sometimes it's not about the high cost of electricity or the high levels of crime in the country, because there are many countries very successful, competitive, they suffer from the same. It doesn't, it's not saying that if you have a very good environment, you can also succeed. I mean, myself, before joining the World Bank, I was in the private sector. I failed 7 times in the US. I'm proud of saying, you know, that I failed. I didn't learn. I think I learned something, but then after I learned, you know, what to do right, I joined the bank, so I'm kind of stuck right now. Hopefully, I will find a new venue later on. But to say that that was the perfect environment, but even though that you are in the perfect environment, you can fail. But the issue in terms of sometimes not finding other venues because the electricity cost is very high, it also raised the question about focusing more on energy efficiency. In the World Bank, we give a lot of loans to countries. For example, just recently to Mexico, I think about $300 million for one state, to basically distribute free of charge to every citizen, every household, the energy efficient light bulbs. The state was able to repay the loan in 2 or 3 years because they have the cost of electricity right away. So there are many things that can be done because with the availability of liquidity, in the availability of new technology, probably you can invest in energy efficiency measures that will have the cost of electricity. If that then will lower the cost of electricity is another question that we need to ask our colleague Kelly to see if that would be possible. But the end is about also the issue of the policies and regulation in a country. I mean, if you want a strong focus, not to reducing the cost of energy, but maybe focusing more on energy efficiency, maybe that one will come down by itself. And also, like Mr. Budan mentioned, maybe if there is going to be some kind of tax-free incentive for bringing solar equipment into the countries for citizens, maybe there can be another venue. But I think that the private sector should shift the focus from say we cannot compete because electricity is high, by saying we need to compete because everybody else is competing, but not us. So I will welcome now Dr. Hutchinson, the Director General of the Planning Institute of Jamaica, to give his remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to start by pointing out that my good friend Giorgio was trying to make a little trouble by having the private sector persons give their presentation first and then say, okay, since the private sector is over, then let's have the government come along. But I just want to point out, Giorgio, that if you listen to what, your presentation on the importance of the certainty of infrastructure, Michelle English's presentation pointed to the need for effective regulation and transparency guarantees and how investments in people is an empowering act. Kelly talking about how climate change and the kind of disaster risk problems we face now are changing the ways in which we look at or assess risk and infrastructure development, and the importance of regulatory certainty, political consistency, judicial fairness. All of those things are actually consistent with what we as the government recognize as being the framework for the kind of collaborative partnerships that we must have with the private sector if we are to modernize our economic plant, modernize our economy going forward. So I just want to start by reminding Georgia that despite your best efforts, there's no separation here today going forward, right here or going forward, because what you're going to be seeing is that at the Planning Institute and the rest of government is a very strong commitment to productive collaboration with our private sector partners as we try to build a private sector economy going forward. Infrastructure development is critical to the overall development of a country's modernization of its utilities, especially in areas such as energy, transport, water supply, and communication. These are some of the bedrock issues that Jamaica will require modernization in as it tries to go forward. While the provision of infrastructure has traditionally been assumed to be a role, something that the state engages in, the private sector has been playing an increasing role through a number of mechanisms, including direct investments in various public-private partnership modalities, telecommunication investment. I mean, we're talking about JPS today. Many of us grew up with a JPS being a public firm. We're talking about we're hearing a private sector perspective, so on and so forth. As a result, what we're seeing is that government policy and the institutional framework, such as a regulatory framework, which is driving some of this discussion today, is playing and must play a more significant role in encouraging and facilitating private sector collaboration, private sector partnership, private sector investments in these same utilities that we're speaking of. Public policy and the institutional framework should ensure that investment in the utility sectors should not only achieve their economic promise, but they should be socially appropriate and consistent with the proper stewardship of our, what we say, our built environment, the challenges that we face by our natural environment. Kelly talks about what she observed as she went out and she saw, right? But that's a challenge that we face. How do we, in this environment, properly steward our natural environment, properly steward our built environment, and properly support the need for our built and our natural environments to provide sustained improvements in people's well-being. That is part of the challenge that we must face as we talk about the ways in which our infrastructure development will support our development. And everything I've said so far is consistent with Vision 2030, the country's national development plan. And just to speak a little to, I think, Michelle's point about the need for a kind of a certainty going forward, we like to brag that Vision 2030 is the only long-term development plan that we have seen in any developing country across the world that has survived now 2 political changes. And that's important because what it means is that despite political change, the elements of it continue to be what we want as a country, and now what we need to do is to figure out how our private sector partners and the government can partner towards the continued production of the aspirational goals that are outlined in Vision 2030. Utility sectors usually rely on fixed networks to deliver their services, and their investments in the past tend to be very lumpy and largely irreversible. Though I think I heard some things today which tell us that technology may be changing the nature of that kind of investment. Investment decisions will be based on the project's level of returns, which is conditional on the cost of input, price of output, levels of taxation, and something which I think we little appreciate, but I think see it a lot with JPS, the importance of effective demand. That is something that must be built into it when we're doing our Highway 2000. Effective demand, was a very important thing. And why I say this is because our investors who are looking for these kind of returns, if they cannot see the investment and the effective demand driving their returns, oftentimes it forces the government to act in a kind of a contingency way, right? And that then has budgetary implications. So we need to have a better sense of that. Government's overarching macroeconomic policy, as well as the regulatory framework, all play important roles, right, in investment decision-making, right, through their impact on the rate of return, and that's why some of the certainty aspects that we heard about here being talked about. This environment should help establish a stable and credible framework for infrastructure investment. And I'm going in a particular place with this, and I can tell you where I'm going to go and then tell you how I'm going to get there. I'm going to make the case that after we talk about private investment, which is where our private sector partners are looking at their players making private investment, and we talk about, so we talk about private capital and we talk about social capital, the importance of trust and all those kind of things. One of the things that our regulatory framework must give is transparency, guarantee, and certainty as public capital. The investment environment must be the combination of private capital, social capital, and public capital. And I'm in essence going to be talking about the importance of public capital and that being a critical role for the regulatory structure of government in ensuring that we create an environment that the private economy can help modernize our infrastructure for our growth objectives. So under this context, we are asking for our regulators to be accountable for the implementing of their mandates, which they have carefully crafted, and to reduce the discretion through which it can exercise. Discretion creates uncertainty and drives up the cost of business. That it doesn't matter whether it has to do with the regulator or with the government having discretionary waivers. It, in general, creates uncertainty. This framework, right, what we desire should have policy consistency, and the regulated firms would have greater certainty about the regulatory outcome that they face over time. The excessive use of discretionary powers by the regulator or the government can introduce uncertainty with detrimental effects on investment incentives. And what tends to happen, and if one just wants to appreciate this, what one has to look at is, you know, when we're talking about the tax reforms that is part of the IMF negotiations, it's no secret that the tax reforms that they are talking about also includes a review and a rethinking of the series of what should I say, waivers and productivity incentives and business incentives and all those other kind of things that over the last 30, 40 years have defined business activities in Jamaica. In part because of the uncertainty of our business environment, the government has had to step in as a kind of a compensating variation with a whole series of tax incentives and tax holidays and other kinds of compensating factors, which now has significant budgetary implications. So one of the things I'm saying is that bringing greater certainty, greater transparency guarantee, greater as a public capital, not only is good for business from a private sector standpoint, it is also good for government from the standpoint of reducing what we may consider to be reducing kind of uncertainties in its budgetary situation, in the contingencies that it may face, or with the kinds of incentives it has to give to compensate for the uncertainties of the business environment. So we argue that excessive use of discretionary powers or excessive discretionary powers in the environment, right, not only is bad for business, but it also encourages a kind of a skewedness. George is here from the World Bank. He knows, for example, that when we talk about the impact of crime on our economy, one of the things that crime does, it skews investments away from urban centers. So where the majority of people live is also not where the investors want to be because of how it skews it. Well, uncertainty in the business environment also skews investments away from the kind of long-term capital-intensive investments that you heard some of our presenters talk about. You want to encourage private capital into the rebuilding of your infrastructure utilities, then you cannot have regulatory or you can't have environmental uncertainty. It does not encourage the kind of long-term capital-intensive kind of investments that we need to get the transaction cost of business to the point where we can have a competitive economy. So I would argue, right, that the kind of regulatory framework that we need to put in place that will foster the kind of collaborative partnership with our private sector that will drive our economy is an extraordinarily important public capital that government must contribute to the business environment. Now, I will also argue, right, that why this is important is because, you know, we face an environment where, you know, poverty, or what should I say, public sector or government poverty clarifies the minds. We no longer can be thinking about, okay, let's have the government go and spend to build the infrastructure. It doesn't have the resources to do that. So it must now invest in creating an environment where the private sector can be a partner in the development of its infrastructure. So government mind is clear. How do we create the environment for the private economy to be leaders and collaborators in the production of the public good while they pursue their private interests? we have to create an environment where they are pursuing their private interests while government stays focused on the development imperative of the production of the public good. So it means not only the kind of regulatory certainty and the political certainty and the things that we spoke of, but also the general business environment. And what I am going to speak to is how, related to this particular conference, the government, as you know, as early as September, but just past this month, the new framework that is going to govern its investment certainty for infrastructure that should provide a greater degree of certainty that will allow these investments. And I must acknowledge the work that many of our international partners I see here have played in this. But what I'm going to speak to is government's response, right, to this by introducing and putting in place, right, its new strategy for public-private partnerships, or PPPs, which is really aimed at creating an environment for the private sector to be a partner. So in essence, right, what the government hopes to do over the medium term, right, is to have targeted public-private partnerships, right, in the production of utility infrastructure. A PPP, or a public-private partnership, is a long-term procurement contract between the public and the private sectors in which the proficiency of each party is focused on designing, financing, building, and operating an infrastructure project or providing services through appropriate sharing of resources, risk, and rewards. This strategy decision, right, which, by the way, was just approved by Cabinet, I think, I see Ambassador Davis just left, but I think October last month, right, after a year of deliberation, the whole utility, the kind of infrastructure, the firms that are invested in infrastructure things, it's supposed to encourage capitalizing on efficiency gains from outsourcing of the provision of public services. It's supposed to see the continued implementation of infrastructure projects which are known to have significant economic benefits. It's supposed to lead to a broadening of the ownership base and direct equity participation in the economy. It's supposed to create new opportunities for pension funds, so on and so forth. And there are all these modalities that can exist, right? You know, there can be your concession agreements, your bill and transfer, your bill lease transfer, your bill operate and transfer, your bill own transfer, all these other kind of things that exist. We are not newcomers to PPPs. Jamaica is not a newcomer to PPPs. In fact, we have had PPPs since the 1980s. So the question is, why now a policy? You know, our Rockfort 60 megawatt plant was built with some kind of a PPP. The privatization of Jamaica Public Service, which took place with the with the government owning some of the shares, was a kind of a PPP. The privatization of Simpson International Airport through concession agreement with the Airport Authority of Jamaica was a kind of a PPP. Highway 2000 projects was a PPP with all the toll roads. The Kingston Container Terminal privatization was a kind of a PPP. What is different is that based on those experiences, Jamaica recognized that significant weaknesses existed in the use of that instrument, which is what the new policy aims to fix. And we had inadequate and ineffective monitoring, right, of the impact it had on the budget, in how it coordinated across all of our development things, right? And the government faced a lot of exposure in terms of financial risk because it did not sufficiently cap the risk or share the risk or make sure things came in to do that. So in recognizing the need to have a strengthened policy, right, you know, we have worked with our international partners and we have put in place a new policy which I see in October, this is last month, the Cabinet approved of it, and it is now going to be housed in the Development Bank of Jamaica. In a nutshell, and I have the policy if you need detail, but in a nutshell, the policy aims to standardize how this modality can be implemented, how it can attract private investors, how it can increase productivity, right, in an environment, in a limited fiscal exposure of government, but also to create broadening and deepening of our capital markets and encourage foreign investment, bringing in people who specialize in these things to bring their knowledge and their talent and their money to come and do things. So we will see some overriding issues like principles like risk transfer issues, value for money for the public on it, fiscal responsibility, so on and so forth. But more importantly, to one of the speaker's points, greater probity and transparency. It is supposed to bring significant transparency guarantees as public capital in how government does its business. So my summary thought, and I can do in a Q&A, I can speak more specifically on it, my summary thoughts are as follows. Regulation is a necessary component of any kind of public-private partnership arrangement or any kind of arrangement for having the private sector be a lead partner in the development of your utility infrastructure. A strong regulatory framework creates an enabling environment for the successful creation and development and expansion of not only PPPs, but also your development paradigm. We're arguing at the Planning Institute that this is a critical public capital to inspire private sector participation in not only our economic dynamism and reforms, but also in the modernization of the country's economic plant. Otherwise, we're going to argue that without having this kind of transparency guarantee as public capital, it is our considered position that we're going to create the perverse incentives which has been a hallmark of Jamaica for 30, 40 years, where, whether we like it or not, corruption and rent-seeking becomes optimal behavior, and it's anti-development. Thanks.
Dr. Hutchinson is a great sparring partner for me. Since I came to Jamaica, he always challenged basically our behavior as well as the World Bank, because sometimes we misbehave, and it happens more often than not. But he made lots of good points. I mean, I think that the transparency issue is very key, but he also made a very good point in terms of the PPPs. We recognize that to be a very important framework in actually for us, the World Bank Group, including our IFC side, they invest in the private sector, is very ready to support the framework. I think that, you know, the other points that Dr. Hutchinson mentioned, I think are also very relevant in terms of the fact that, you know, even the previous government, but also this government, they're all talking about how they can increase the private sector environment in terms of having an environment that is more enabled to growth. My conversation, especially with the Minister Anthony Hilton in terms of the logistic hub, but also Peter Phillips in terms of the modernization of the government, but also with the Prime Minister in terms of many other aspects of possible growth activities in the country. They all point to the same focus that we should support the country in doing something in terms of creating this environment that will enable the FDIs, as the Permanent Secretary mentioned, to be much more effective here in Jamaica. So we are a partner in I think that, you know, our Flow in JPS colleagues are also partnering in all of this. We are all benefiting from being here in Jamaica and supporting their Vision 2030. I think I would like to give a round of applause to the panel.
Mr. Chairman. Well, I think in the case of Mr. Budan, you seem to have said that increasing the generation capacity will lower prices for consumers. If that is what you said.
No.
No, yeah. Oh, you didn't say that?
No.
Okay, all right.
I just said that we need to ensure that we have adequate reserve capacity to meet the country's needs.
Okay. Yeah, because I was going to say that in our case, additional generation wouldn't reduce the prices to consumers. So I was wondering how that would happen in your case. But since that's not what you said, I'll shift off from you. Mr. Hutchinson, or Dr. Hutchinson, sorry, one of the Caribbean's most distinguished economists, Trevor Farrell, had a conversation with Patrick Manning when he was out of government. So he said Patrick Manning told him, listen, you know, we have to have energy policy that has nothing to do with political parties. He said, that's an excellent idea. He said, however, when Patrick Manning became Prime Minister, he forgot all of that and did something else. Well, as you know, in Trinidad and Tobago, we had this 20-20 2020 vision policy.
Right.
And when the government changed, that went out the window.
Right.
So I'm interested to find out how you all were able to carry forward your 2030 policy despite the change of government.
We have studied Trinidad's experience with their 2020 not surviving the political change, but I just want to speak to 2 points. The first issue about the conversation that Trevor Farrar you mentioned, had with Patrick Manning, goes to the heart of the point, I think, was it Michelle that you made about the importance of political consistency, right? And it is so critical because, executive change or political change, the risk of that prevents business decisions from being long-term. And if you're talking about infrastructure development, if you're talking about the things that Kelly spoke of about how climate change, and climate change adaptation is going to require new ways of assessing risk and new ways of incentivizing investments into these things, then what you're talking about is policies that must skip political change. They must go beyond that political change. So, Vision 2030, we have the good fortune of it being started by one party. It's a very collaborative process. It's what we practice, what we call public scholarship, which is collaborative knowledge making, with, for, and about various communities and publics. So as we speak, every week, teams of colleagues are having town hall meetings all across Jamaica, just to ensure that communities remain invested in what it means to say that Jamaicans are empowered to achieve their fullest promise. Well, Michelle spoke about investing in people as an act of empowerment. Well, you know what? In the town hall meetings, they need to understand how the private sector partners is also invested in that first principle of Vision 2030 as a way of its continuity, and so on, and so on, and so on. And so what we understand is that we don't take for granted this issue. We have given out, 35, 40,000 popular edition. We have the large workbook, a smaller popular edition, giving it out to schools all across. We're giving it out to people who are site challenged. The point I'm making is we recognize that it represents the consilient goals of Jamaicans, irrespective of political divide. And so we have to invest in it, but also make sure that our private sector partners understand how their pursuit of their private interests can also be consistent with the national interests as captured and framed out in Vision 2030, and that is what we're seeing, and that is why I said to Giorgio that there's no difference here. There's no seam of a difference here, because this is about our private partners being totally committed and being a partner with us. And we don't ask them to be philanthropists or altruists. We ask them to pursue their private interests, but we understand that oftentimes we can find points of collaboration where the pursuit of their private interests also leads to the production of the public good. And that is where we are at with this.
Yes,
go ahead.
2 short questions. Why is it that the local stock market is not used as a channel for investment in utility infrastructure? That more people could get involved and participate in the investment. Concerning the monopolies in infrastructure, are we having a guaranteed rate of return to these monopolies? If, persons who fall in that category, getting a guaranteed rate of return for their investment in such utility. To bear in mind also, Mr. Buddha mentioned about the non-technical loss. I think we should be concerned also about the technical loss concerning JPS, because that is the thing. And utilities in general have a captive audience. These are basic goods and services or services that is offered to the public. And a certain level must be available to the general public. Thanks.
Let me give you a brief answer about what I hear here from the private sector in general, for which they don't really look into the stock market in terms of investments. I think that it's a very common answer that I heard also in other countries. I think that sometimes is the lack of a long-term vision. Many countries now, they are having, for example, a 10 or 15 or 20 years infrastructure development plan in which basically everything is laid out in terms of what the country would do. And also they have an established basically PPP infrastructure. Now that is as far as I can tell you in answering your question. Maybe some people from the panel, they have a better answer than mine, but this is what I gather from many people in the private sector.
I can't really address the stock market question other than to say that right now at least our utility is owned 40% by Marubeni, 40% by EWP, and 20% by the government. Someone would have to sell their shares, and I think you have to have 20% to be on the stock markets. That would require someone to divest. I would like to address the guaranteed rate of return, because there's a theoretical rate of return that is dependent on a number of things, one of which is expected gigawatt hours, or how much we're actually going to sell of our product. And when we had a rate case, that was envisioned to be something that we have not achieved. In fact, it's much below those projections. So I'll give you an idea. Currently, the return on investment's about 1% of sales right now, which is not an investment by any stretch or any parameter that we'd use. Our shareholders are not allowed to get a dividend now based on our financial performance, so there is completely no guaranteed rate of return. The second topic I could address is technical losses. We absolutely care about technical losses. We're currently about 25% last month of losses. 10 of that was technical losses. We are in the process of looking at our system end to end and seeing where we can decrease that. I will just point out that what we have determined, and we continue to look, is to decrease that by 1%. We've estimated an investment of $200 million US, so it does come at a significant price. And to give you another perspective, prior to this, I managed a utility in the US called Pennsylvania Electric Company that had a topography somewhat similar, not as mountainous, but somewhat similar, had 17,000 square miles as opposed to 17,000 square kilometers that we have with distribution. And our technical loss was 8%, and we decided that was optimum. But we're not taking our eye off the ball, technical losses. We continue to focus on that daily. The low voltage situation is causing us a problem, but we do have a team that's focused on technical losses as well. For us, it's just what we can control, and what we're technically capable to control is more technical losses, because that's what my guys went to school to learn. That's what they do. They're engineers. I think with the other part of the non-technical losses, they didn't go to school to be police officers. They went to school, they're really not well positioned to go into red zones and deal with that kind of environment. In fact, what's required sometimes in those environments to get in, I think it jeopardizes the lack of corruption that I'm committed to make sure happens at JPS.
If I can summarize in closing, I think that there is much of a call from the government and the society, the private sector, to increase competitiveness in Jamaica. It's very clear by the different plans that are here, and as Dr. Hutchinson mentioned, I think there is very much a unity in the government, and also it's part of Vision 2030. However, with that competitiveness agenda, there will be an increased demand on the current infrastructure, utilities infrastructure especially. And I think that that's basically we need to be addressed, and I think that the regulator is the one that can best support the development of this agenda, also in line with the various ministries that will be part of it. At the end of the day, I think at the end of this forum, I think that maybe there is something that should come out in terms of really looking at the long-term agenda more than the short-term gains, and especially with the strong focus on energy. I think that maybe the focus on energy efficiency could be one that could be addressed very quickly. Thank you very much, everyone. I think the lunch is somewhere upstairs on the 17th floor. It was a pleasure to be here with you today. Bye-bye.